Maranatha by Ralston. Part 1. Revelation. It was on that particular and foreseeably insignificant day, the 11th one of the 8th month in the year 1962, when Hugh Birchman realized that Armageddon was not a thing, but rather a place. That is, unless and needless to say, a thing is a place. Then, in that case, Hugh Birchman had known about Armageddon for a long, long time, though he had never been. Where Birchman had been, however, was practically everywhere else. Everywhere from Albuquerque to St. Louis, which just so happened to be where he and the missus had left and where they were headed, and everywhere in between. While Mrs. Birchman's favorite pastime was drooling against the passenger side window for the 17-and-a-half-hour trip, her husband was far more interested in sightseeing, though it was not as if he had a say-so in the matter, considering he was always billed with the drive. It was not your average sightseeing that he was interested in, however. Most folks would just be content in seeing some mountains, or a quick peek at the ocean or a lake through some trees, or, on a rare occasion, something like Mount Rushmore or the Grand Canyon. Not Hugh Birchman, though. Hugh was far more interested in the exotic, which was the last thing he'd ever find back at home in New Mexico, where just about the most exotic thing you'd find were those little stars that are rubbing your eyes for a minute and a half. He loved what they'd call roadside attractions, quirky, glorified tourist traps, and Hugh was fully aware of that. He knew that they were gigantic wastes of time and money, sometimes literally, if the place featured an oversized dinosaur or alligator or something of the variety. But he never gave those concerns any mind. Sometimes he simply enjoyed wasting his time in the company of his wife, a novelty that was beginning to wane. He and the missus weren't exactly on the best of terms, hence the going on a 3-hour window nap, and he figured the world's biggest ball of twine, or a motel shaped like a 3-story trout, was not going to rekindle their flame of over 5 years. It was only after he read the billboard saying, "See the second coming," that Hugh loosened his grip on the steering wheel and poked that nose of his over the dashboard as the display zipped by. There was another up ahead by the looks of it, so he feathered the brake with his big toe, dropping the buggy from 70 down to 55. "These Bible Belt signs are always a trip," he said, something like laughter bubbling in his throat when the image of an oversized and sweaty minister popped into his head. Talk about one hell of a Bible Belt. He knew he was talking to himself, but he said it loud enough in the hopes that it would wake his not-so-better half from her slumber and piss her off. It didn't work. The second one was even more bizarre, and he could really make it out because of how slow he was going now. "He has returned," it read, and just below it, "The second advent awaits." "What the hell is an advent?" he said, and this time only to himself. But also, this was the time that she actually bothered to listen. "It's the few weeks before Christmas, Hughie," Mrs. Birchman said, still looking out the window. She must have not noticed the sign, despite it being just beyond the glass, because she hadn't even looked up from her resting position. "Then, what the hell is the second one?" "Language, Hughie," she said, though she wasn't snappy like that morning. "It's the second coming." "That's what the first one said." "First what?" She was sitting up now, and her hair was all crazy. "The first billboard," he said, slowly, as if he were explaining it to a child. "The first billboard said, 'See the second coming.'" "How are you supposed to see it?" she asked, high-pitched and sounding of genuine confusion. Hugh shrugged. "How the hell should I know?" "Language, please, Hughie." "Language?" Hugh said, cutting her off. How the hell is a hell language? You use that odd damn word all the time. She bit her lip, but he could tell that he had pissed her off. She turned back to the window and was probably about to go off on some kind of sermon about blasphemy, but the third billboard passed them both by and left them silently stumped. It read, "Meet the Christ." "What the hell?" Mrs. Birchman said. It just kind of slipped out. "Language," Hugh snapped right back to her, grinning from ear to ear. His wife turned a bit red in the face, but he could tell she was more concerned about the sign than the swear. "Oh, what?" her husband asked. "You want to meet him?" "I already have," she said smugly, in typical Christianese. "What kind of signs are these anyways?" "Probably just the same old, Hugh said, eyebrows raised. This wasn't the first time that religious kooks had managed to plaster out the western landscape with their fire and brimstone billboards, and it certainly wouldn't have been the last. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Aw, you know," Hugh said, glancing over to his wife. "How many churches did we drive by just on the way to the gas station this morning? 20? 25? I don't know." She shrugged. "Probably a lot of them," he said. "And it's always business as usual. Accept Jesus or burn in hell. Your choice. But there's only one right answer." "You know that's not what they say, Huey," his wife said. She was calmer than he would have expected. "Well, I can read between the lines, babe," Hugh said, tightening his grip on the wheel and squinting at the fourth and seemingly final sign, approaching quickly on the right. It read simply, "Salvation. Next exit." "Oh, that's just real nice," his wife said as the sign swiped by through the trees. She shook her head. "What do you think it even is? A megachurch?" A megachurch certainly would have explained some of the billboards, and the cash needed to put them there, but it wouldn't have explained why they almost made the place appear like some kind of experience or amusement, not unlike the way you'd see mouse ears while driving by Disneyland. Either the joint was some kind of Pentecostal shoutfest, or one of those very roadside amusements that Hugh Birchman enjoyed so dearly. "Well, if it's not a megachurch," Hugh said, sitting up from his slump, "it's definitely some kind of theme park." "A theme park?" his wife said, her voice plucky. "A theme park church?" "I don't know about that, but it could be some kind of Bible land or whatever." "Bible land?" "Yeah, remember that thing we went to last summer, Dinosaur Land?" "I wouldn't call that a theme park, Huey," Mrs. Birchman said, looking back out the window. "Well, what would you call it?" "A tourist trap? But then again, you seem to like those." "Yeah, but I'm not the only one." He patted his wife on her thigh. "Remember that stegosaurus we got the picture on?" "You mean the green jungle gym we got a picture on? Oh yeah, I haven't forgotten about that one, Huey. Remember the kid sliding down its neck?" "Wasn't he in the picture?" His wife nodded, and the two shared a laugh before it became bitterly silent, as if they weren't supposed to be enjoying the presence of one another. Hugh sighed. "Why don't we do that more often?" he asked. His wife turned to him in the wake of his question and was about to ask, "You mean Dino Land?" But she knew what he meant. She turned back to face the road and noticed the exit quickly approaching, and at that moment, she longed for that feeling they both shared last summer and the summers before it. "Yeah," she said, pointing up at the exit sign and passing him a faint yet noticeable smile in the rearview mirror. "Why don't we?" Chapter 2. As the first stoplight just off the exit approached, Mr. and Mrs. Birchman watched as a sun-lit road sign passed with the ever-so-convenient words, "Second coming, turn right," plastered upon it in ugly yellow lettering. The light up ahead turned yellow, too, and Mrs. Birchman took that unassuming coincidence to heart and figured that the sign must have been a sign. And she'd always tell her husband, "There are no such things as coincidences. Maybe we should slow our roll here, Hughie." "What do you mean?" her husband asked, already clicking the blinker. She didn't realize it yet, but he was already dead set on scoping the place out, even if it was just a glorified house of prayer in the middle of nowhere. It truly was the middle of nowhere, come to think of it. Not an ounce of development for miles on either side of the road. In fact, the drive had become so muddled, with only slight variations in the trees and landscapes indicating where the hell they were, that Hugh had forgotten where in the actual hell they were. It could have been anywhere from Riverton, Kansas to Oklahoma City. The boondocks certainly had a way about them where you just couldn't tell where one booney ended and another began. All Hugh knew was that for the first time in nearly 7 hours, both the Mr. and Mrs. could actually see some clouds not covered up by warehouses or big trees or billboards, except for the road sign, that is. "Do you really think it's worth it?" Mrs. Birchman asked. "I mean, depending on how long it takes, we might have to book a hotel. Wouldn't you rather just drive straight through to St. Louis?" Hugh chuckled a little. "Babe, it's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Who knows? Maybe this is going to be our new favorite spot." "Bible land?" she said, unable to help herself from smirking a little. "Yeah, I thought you loved the Bible," he said, smirking right back. "I thought you didn't." He thought about his wife's statement for a moment, and he supposed at one point he actually had, during the days of his youth when his life wasn't so complicated, and when his mother was still around. He turned the wheel right just as the light went green. "I'm trying to keep an open mind." His wife smiled. "Then I guess I will too." Chapter 3. "I guess we better turn around." Hugh once again loosened his grip on the steering wheel as he leaned to read the road sign. Christ left. Approaching on their right, Mrs. Birchman snapped her gaze to face him, and her husband peripherally grinned at her in the rearview mirror. So, he shows up for the second time and leaves. Not like I could blame him. His wife shot a hot breath out of her nose and shook her head. It was a pretty bad joke that only a dad would make. Then again, Hugh wasn't exactly a father. At least not yet. They had been trying for the past 3 years. But when all those years amounted to a miscarriage and a sexual performance enhancer, trying was just about the only word that summed it up. Hugh's rear-facing grin soon diminished just as he and his wife entered a small clearing followed by a remote and tiny little town. Little was actually an overstatement, as the place might have been more akin to a campsite than a legitimate city. In fact, maybe it was town that was the overstatement. None of the residences, if such a word even applied, were permanently placed, as nearly all of them were either temporary tents of some fashion, or bona fide tool sheds, hastily thrown up as if done in a hurry. "I doubt they even have zip codes around here," Hugh said once again, reclaiming his grin. This time, however, it was a nervous one. "Do they usually at campsites?" Hugh shot his wife a quick look. "This doesn't look like any campsite I've ever seen. At least not any from the Cub Scouts. This looks like one of those internment camps from World War II. Hugh rolled to a stop amid the dusty road, flinging dirt and God knows what into the air. It was dead quiet, at least until his wife shook him by the shoulder and whispered, "Hughie, don't stop. Let's go." "I'm just looking," he said. And like the curious cat he was, Hugh rolled down the windows and took in the stagnant, hot August air. It smelled like wet clay, and, for some reason, his grandmother's house. Maybe because of the distant scent of a home-cooked meal. But who was cooking, and where the home was beyond him. "Come on, Hughie," his wife said, and she nudged him again. Hugh nodded, rolled up the windows, and let his foot off the brake. The buggy began rolling again, and just as it did, Mrs. Birchman could see the wide eyes of a middle-aged woman staring back at her from one of the wooden shacks. She turned to face forward and didn't tell her husband. It might have frazzled him, she thought. Little did she know that Hugh had also locked eyes with a handful of folks. Some of them waved, but all of them stared like deers in headlights. "I think it's just up ahead," Hugh said, filling the silence. It was unbearably quiet, not just between him and the missus, but all around them. Say what you will about Albuquerque, but at least you could always find a drunk singing his lungs out on the nearest street corner. And though he'd probably shank you for a nickel, at least there was some comfort in hearing a fellow human being in the sound of their voice. No such comfort was to be found wherever the hell this was. "Armageddon," Mrs. Birchman said, and she pointed a trembling finger to a placard hung boldly on a little wooden building just beyond the others. It was likely the town's, again as the name applies, City Hall. At least, what used to be a city hall. Not a thing, a place, Hugh mumbled under his breath. So quiet that not even his wife heard him. "Hughie, I don't like this." "It's right there," Hugh said to his wife, and they both looked across the deserted road to what was clearly an old Shell gas station, repainted to look a little more inviting. Although, if anything, the ugly-as-sin mustard-yellow paint job was the only thing that might have kept Hugh away. If not, of course, for his crippling curiosity. Chapter 4. There was one other car in the lot, a baby blue station wagon, whose shade made Hugh realize that he had left his sunglasses in the service station's restroom that morning, and which stuck out like a sore blue thumb against the piss-yellow coloring of the eyesore store, wrapped in the words, "The Second Coming," across where the name Shell likely once resided. It reminded Hugh of when his block used to convert the abandoned Donaldson residence into a haunted house every Halloween, or when Jimmy's hardware store on the corner used to let the Cub Scouts pitch a tent outside for their Christmas tree lot. Square pegs in round holes. Hugh listened as his wife slammed the passenger door shut and made her way to his side on the dusty cement. Before he could get a word in, or some kind of sly remark to put them both at peace, she lifted her hand and pointed at the building. It wasn't until he followed her finger that he realized it was pointed not at it, but through it, at the silhouette of a woman standing inside, beckoning the couple with a gesture only obscured by window tint, making the place look as if it were midnight at 4 o'clock, or rather 3:55. It was 3:56 by the time they had let themselves inside, greeted not only by the sound of a cowbell knocking into the top of the smudgy glass door in the tune of an old Hank Williams hymn, but also the smell of frankincense and the form of a waddling woman approaching at top speed, or at least the top speed of a 250-pound penguin. As she did so, they each got a better look at her impending presence. Namely, she was round. So round, in fact, that Hugh wondered how the hell she managed to wedge her way into that station wagon outside. He got his answer but a split second after asking his question, as she wedged herself between the couple, wrapped her flabby arms around them at the waist and squeezed. For being such a large lady, she was rather nimble. "Thank God," she said, loosening her grip and shuffling backward on her flip-flops to appraise them. "I didn't want you to miss 'em," she said, snapping her gaze to the clock on the wall just above a closed red curtain. It was 3:57 now, and right in front of the curtain a sign, like one of those please be seated ones you'll find at a posh restaurant, stood slapped with the words, "Next meet and greet, 4 p.m." upon it. Compared to the afternoon sun, the place was rather dim and smoky, and a quick glance over Hugh's shoulder confirmed his suspicions. This was some kind of cheapo tourist trap, complete with rows and rows of superfluous shelves stacked high with more knickknacks than a paddywhack, and trinkets tanning in 5 different shades of fluorescent white. A closer inspection revealed these to be an assortment of snow globes, bobbleheads, and t-shirts, all of which sported the same beatnik-looking character. "Who were we about to miss?" Hugh overheard his wife ask the woman. It was a higher-pitched, more sing-songy tone than one she had used with him not 5 minutes prior. Leave it to the missus to treat her husband with more contempt than some random fatty from mile 3. Speaking of which, she wasn't alone, as out of the same walkway of wimwams came a similarly shaped man, dressed in a button-up Hawaiian shirt and fedora, and holding a coffee mug in his hand, examining it as if it were a precious gemstone. "Oh, you know," the woman said with a wink, leading Mrs. Birchman by the hand. "They always say we never know the day nor hour," the man in the fedora piped in, grinning over to Hugh like he was making small talk about the weather. "But 4 o'clock seems pretty straightforward to me," he chuckled, his belly bouncing as he did. Once he was finished, he wiped a sweaty palm on his aloha shirt and extended the hand to Hugh. "The name's Deke. Deke Marshall and my wife, Sue." He gestured over to his better half, and she gave Hugh a little wave. He could see the shimmer of her silver cross necklace draped around her neck. "This is so exciting," she said, jittering like a kid on Christmas morning. "Deke didn't believe me when I told him he came back already, but what do you know? And I really couldn't believe it when I saw the traffic into this place. I mean, come on. What's it take to get people out of bed these days? This place is like a ghost town." "That's because only a few find it," a calming voice said from behind the curtain. The red drapes slowly parted, and a smiling, long-haired guy in a white robe stepped into the dimly lit room. "After all, the road is narrow." It was the pale, hippie-looking guy from all the t-shirts and bobbleheads, and if Hugh didn't know any better, he'd say he was a spitting image of the portrait his mother had hung in their kitchen. A portrait of Jesus. Chapter 5. "Oh my God!" the fat woman belched. It was like she had just seen a buck-naked Elvis. "Yes?" the hippie man smiled. The woman trotted across the store and extended her hand toward the man, who accepted it with a kiss. She gasped. I love your book," she said, unbuttoning the purse draped from her shoulder and retrieving a small Bible from out of it. "I've read the whole thing. Would you sign it?" The beatnik chuckled and held out his arms. "With pleasure," he said. He took the book and began scribbling inside it. "What passage is your favorite?" She swallowed, and Hugh watched as her double chin winced. I like all of them," she smiled. The hippy-dippy nodded. "I know you do," he said. "Leviticus 3:16 comes to mind, though. A favorite, perhaps?" The woman grinned. "Yes, of course," she lied. Hugh could tell just by her worried grin that she didn't have the first clue about Leviticus 3:16. The Jesus figure nodded. "You should read the sequel." "There's a Bible, too?" "There is indeed. Now, you'll find it on aisle 1. Then the man turned to face the woman's not-so-better half and held on that expression that reminded Hugh of the look he gave his wife as she walked down the aisle. "And you must be her husband." The pudgy man nodded and extended his hand. "How'd you know?" he snickered. His face was now red like a radish. "What's Leviticus 3:16? Hugh whispered out of the side of his lips, just as the hippie shook the hand of Deke Marshall and hugged his wife. Mrs. Birchman shook her head in confusion. "I think he must have meant John 3:16. "Why?" "Because Leviticus 3:16 is about burning the fat of a goat." She shrugged. Hugh puckered his lips. "Well, my friends, before we go inside," the hippie said, slapping Mr. and Mrs. Marshall on their backs, "let's not forget about our other friends." He gestured over to the Birchmans and his face lit up, especially when he got a good look at Hugh's wife. "A shepherd always knows his flock," he said, approaching Mrs. Birchman. "You must be..." "Leah Birchman, but you already..." "Yes, I did," the man said, nodding, then turned his face to Hugh. "And you must be her bridegroom." "Yeah, I'm Hugh Birchman." "And you are... him?" "I am." The long-haired stranger smiled coyly. "Call me Emmanuel." "Or Manny," Deke Marshall blurted, with a series of spirited nods. Emmanuel, or Manny, as Mr. Marshall called him, agreed with the fat man as he peered at Hugh with his vivid brown eyes and a toothy smile, reading him like a dime store paperback. "Is something wrong, Hugh?" "No, it's just that... well, if you were Christ, I would have expected a bit more... oh, I don't know... pomp and circumstance? I'd even bet there'd be a line from here to Portland if you were Christ. All you need is some better advertising, and every Christian from every coastline would flock to this little hole in the wall. Who's your publicity guy?" Emmanuel, as he called himself, chuckled and wagged his head, which looked like an old mop scrubbing tile. "You're a skeptical one, aren't you, Hugh?" Hugh nodded. "It's like you knew," he said sarcastically. Clearly, Mrs. Marshall didn't read between the lines, because just as he finished his slick comment, she blurted out an amen with a cheer of zeal from across the store. Emmanuel looked at Leah and then back to her husband. "Well, I did promise to be something of a thief in the night," he said with a smile. "What about the rapture, the tribulation?" Leah asked. She too was prying, but unlike Hugh, she was hopeful in this, as he called himself a stranger. "Semantics," Emmanuel answered her. "Everyone is a theologian, as they say, but when you know as much about theology as I do, you begin to see just how divisive it can be," he said. He then turned and gestured for the group to follow him back through the mysterious red curtain from which he came. "Come, follow me," he said, and they did. The other side of the curtain was far darker than the gift shop, and clearly the other half of a gas station split in two, walls adorned in the same red fabric, reflecting the dim light that shone throughout the narrow space. In the center of the room, the first thing they all noticed was a throne, which either was a priceless centuries-old artifact or a gold-painted seat from the local Goodwill. It was hard to tell in such dim light. "Welcome to my throne room," he said, as he crossed the rainbow drawn across the floor. Above him, hung by a fishing line, were 4 strange puppet-like creatures, 6 wings, each covered in googly eyes. One was what appeared to be a lion, an ox or a bull, one a man, and the last an eagle. Each swung in a random, somewhat circular direction, and the eagle nearly slapped Hugh in the face with its feathers. Leah swallowed. And behold, a throne sat in heaven, and there was a rainbow around it. And in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures full of eyes, Emmanuel said, turning to face her. And they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Leah nodded. Revelation 4. Emmanuel returned the gesture. You sure know your stuff. How about a picture? He pointed to the throne, and much like those Santas you see at the mall come Christmas, plopped into position. Leah, to both his and her husband's astonishments, shook her head. I'd love to, Mrs. Marshall said with her hands clasped. She nudged her husband, reading a placard along the wall, and dragged him over before the throne. And talk about a Christmas card, hun, she said. Guess you can't get any better than a pic with the birthday boy, huh? Her husband replied, pulling a Kodak from somewhere within his mask. He aimed it at the throne, Emmanuel in it, and watched through the lens as his wife hobbled up to it. Hugh was grinning from ear to ear, watching the makeshift Messiah do his best to grin and bear it through the near 300-pounder dropping down onto his lap. Clearly, the chair was not antique. Hugh let out a tiny chuckle just as the woman stood, and his wife turned to meet his eyes. Hers were far more forgiving, and somewhere within them was the same look of bewilderment you'd see in a child's. Hugh squinted, but that look on her face never left. His eyes then drifted down to his own hands, one clutching the other in a sweaty embrace, and followed the scab from his bitten nail down to his knuckle, an etched-in tally mark of the 4th picket fence that had, itself, decided to pick against both him and his hammer. The next scar, his 5th, would most assuredly be a cross, not down. If you are who you say you are, Hugh said, letting go of his hand, surely you had the power to heal. Emmanuel leaned forward in his golden chair, never once breaking his gaze at Hugh. Hugh's, however, was broken, mostly by the round woman nudging her husband, a look on his face as glazed over as a jelly-filled donut. About that, Mr. Marshall said, stepping forward and drawing Emmanuel's attention. I didn't want to bring it up, but, well, he's got hemorrhoids, his other half blurted out. Again, he's tried the cream and everything. It's real bad, Manny. She shook her head. Consider it gone, the man on the throne nodded. And as for you, Sue, you have an undiagnosed tumor on your left lung. And do you smoke by chance? She shook her head. Never, but my daddy did, a pack a day. Emmanuel nodded down again. It is healed. His smiling gaze then turned to Hugh, who clearly wasn't impressed by an unseen, uncorroborated healing. And for you, Mr. Birchman, the hippie-looking man said, stepping down from his throne. Hugh is fine, thanks. Hugh, I'd like to speak with you, privately, if that'd be okay with your wife, that is. Leah glanced from the hippie-looking man to her husband and hesitantly nodded. Great, Mrs. Birchman. And you too, he said, looking at the Marshalls. You'll be with a Jamie. Who's Jamie? Hugh asked. The stranger's smile widened. Even the helper needs help sometimes, Hugh. Chapter 6. Leah listened as the cowbell rattled a benediction to the group as they passed through the narrow doorway leading back out into the blistering heat of the afternoon sun. It was like a herd of cattle exiting a gas station-shaped corral, and now that she was out, She could hear the wind whistling over the rolling hills of nothingness like Dixie, and feel the thick, wet air spreading across the tall and unruly grass like butter. Rancid, liquefied butter. Or, as the folks in parts such as those would call it, lard. Mr. and Mrs. What's-Their-Name were mumbling some form of excited banter back and forth in one another's ears, and Leah could practically feel the spit in hers from nearly 10 paces behind them. It made her squirm, which, by her definition, meant trotting right past the couple and shoulder to shoulder with Jamie, who was in a bit of a trot herself, not unlike a show horse. Excuse me, Jamie?" "Yes, dear?" Jamie asked, not breaking her breakneck pace and forward stare. Where are we going exactly?" Jamie halted dead in her tracks as the dust from beneath her boots continued down the dirt path. She spun on her raised heel to face the three, the couple having caught up with Leah now, and clapped her hands together like a teacher bringing order to a class full of juvenile delinquents. The hot, wet wind hung in the air, and it was so quiet that Leah could hear a highway honk from what must have been at least 10 miles away. Jamie heaved a breath, and as she spoke, lowered her voice so it wouldn't travel. "Maranatha, brothers and sisters." Mrs. What's-Her-Name returned the unfamiliar greeting. "Maranatha?" Jamie smiled and corrected her. "Maranatha. The early church used the phrase as a greeting of peace. It means our Lord has come, or come, O Lord," she said. "And, well, he has. So we're celebrating that fact by throwing him a little surprise party. A holiday, if you will." "Oh, I love holidays," the round woman said with a little hop. Her husband agreed. "You should try her cooking. And come Christmas, she makes the best fruit cake this side of the Mississippi." Leah could hear her husband's voice in her head. "He's got that right. Talk about a fruitcake." But before his ethereal tone could finish, Jamie continued with a well-meaning nod. "Well, that's perfect. We're in need of a couple of helping hands in the kitchen. If you want to, of course." "Of course," the woman said. Her husband patted her on the back, supporting her enthusiasm, and that left only Leah, who slowly realized all eyes were, naturally, gathered onto her now. It was that same creeping feeling she felt on their drive into the place, and the same feeling that was driving her out. Still, she agreed. "Sounds like fun." "Great," Jamie said, as if it were prepared. "Think of it like Christmas or Easter. Those celebrate the birth and resurrection of the Lord, and Maranatha, well, celebrates his return. And what's a better reason for celebration than that?" The group agreed, though Leah hesitantly so. "I'll explain it all once we get into City Hall, but the main thing I need y'all's help with is cleanup." Jamie smiled with a clasp of her hands. "Tomorrow is our Sabbath here in Armageddon, and the Lord has some strict guidelines on how he wants us to rest. And that includes tearing down this party of ours. But after the jamboree we're about to have, I think rest is exactly what we'll need." Chapter 7. "Leviticus 3:16, huh?" Hugh said. His fingers were gripped around the arms of the office armchair to the point where his knuckles began turning white. Emmanuel laughed in his throat and plopped himself into the chair just behind the desk, brows furrowed. "They never read the book. I don't think half of them can even read, period." "What do you mean?" Hugh asked, sitting up in his seat. "Leviticus 3:16, Emmanuel repeated, a full set of pearly whites staring back at Hugh like the gates of heaven. "And the priest shall burn the goat, yada, 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 and make a sweet fire for God, yada, 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 and something, something. All the fat is the Lord's." He slapped his palms flat on the table and leaned forward, his brows now raised. "I mean, did you see that ugly goat out there?" He snickered. I think she forgot to shave her chins this morning. Talk about needing to burn fat. Wait, I'm confused. Hugh interrupted him. Emmanuel leaned back in his creaking chair and crossed one leg over his knee like a Lincoln log. I guess I overestimated your bullshit detector, he said with a smug grin. Hugh squinted at him just to make sure he was reading the situation correctly. He was. You're not? Of course I'm not. Yeah, no, I'm the fucking Easter Bunny. For God's sakes, man. My name's Aaron. Hugh pushed his ass tighter into the seat and swallowed, tasting the ghost of the egg and cheese bagel from that morning. I thought you were. Crazy? Yeah, I know, the stranger who now called himself Aaron said. Well, surprise, he continued as he lifted his apathetic jazz hands into the air. I'm not, but they are. He pointed to the dark gray wall beside him and beyond it, to the town of Armageddon at large. They're nuts. I mean, God bless them, they pay for all my shit. But they're nuts. Hugh began assembly at the puzzle in his head, squeezing the armchair and letting go. So, this is some kind of cult? Aaron shrugged. Cults are usually run by nuts for nuts. I'm not crazy. I'm just crazy smart. I cheated the system. What system? Hugh scratched the back of his neck. The system. 1 minute I'm borderline homeless, and the next I got random jimmies paying me to bless their baby. What changed? Aaron leaned forward with a gleeful grin. I got religion, and picked it up from an old friend. Hugh shook his head. You weren't raised in church? 'Cause you seem to know a lot about it. I did my homework, Hugh, Aaron said, rocking in his squeaking chair. But yeah, I suppose you're right. My mother was devoutly Catholic. And what happened? I take it you're not Catholic anymore? Never was, Aaron said. He lifted his arms and set his folded hands on the table, licking his lips. My mom was a good Catholic. She went to Mass twice a week and prays the rosary and all that shit. Then, one day, she got sick. Real sick. Bedridden. I was never Catholic, like I said, but on that day, I was real close. My mom started watching this guy on TV with all that time in bed, a preacher guy. She told me, Aaron, I know God's gonna heal me. That guy was filling her head with all kinds of stuff. One day she tells me that she sent him money for his ministry. Said the blessing's coming back, and she blessed him real good. $6,000. Or if you knew the penny pinchers that my folks were. My college fund. She promised me she'd make it back when she got well. Died a week later. And Mr. Preacher Man was caught in a Honolulu with a couple of hookers not long after that. Talk about a blessed mission trip. Aaron nodded to himself and wiped a stray tear off his cheek, sniffling. My daddy wasn't a religious man, but on the day she died, he told me Mama went home with the Lord. How fucking sad. That's not a home. Not with a God that'd do that to somebody. You should have seen her at the end, Hugh. You should have seen her. Hugh shook his head and clenched his eyes. I'm... sorry. Didn't ask for an apology, Aaron said, shaking his head. Hugh, now more confused than before, did the same. So she dies and you do all this? He asked, stiffening up. For Christ's sake, man, everyone's mom dies. And isn't it terrible? Yeah, but why are you telling me this? He listened with his eyes still shut as Aaron's chair squeaked forward. Because you're different. Hugh's eyes snapped open. He didn't say a word, but somehow those peepers spoke plenty. Most of the stupid hicks that come here already believe that I am who I say I am. Or at least they want to believe. Even your wife wants to believe. She doesn't, but she wants to, Hugh. You don't. You're the first sorry bastard in this place who didn't want to believe this shit. Why? Hugh swallowed. Common sense. No, it's more than that, Aaron said, standing up and pacing to the corner of the room. I've had my fair share of skeptics come through here, and some of them even hardcore atheists, but even they want to believe it. Why don't you, Hugh? Hugh shrugged a little. I try to be open-minded. Aaron snickered. Just don't be like the fella that was too open-minded. Why? His brain fell out. Hugh loosened his grip on the chair. So, what do you want? Aaron scoffed and fell back into his chair. I want a lot of things, Hugh. He crisscrossed his fingers and placed his hands atop the desk. I want to be able to eat something good without having to take a pilgrimage to McDonald's. Since when are cheeseburgers not kosher? I thought all that shit was for shrimp. And I want women whose parents aren't related. I mean, what about me? What do you want from me? From us? Hugh immediately thought of Leah, and his blood ran cold. Where'd you take my wife? Your wife, Aaron said, centering the cross on the desk from its crooked position, is a very beautiful woman, Hugh, and congratulations on that. How many years have you been together? Hugh swallowed. Where is she? Aaron scoffed again. Oh, she's fine, I promise. Come on, man, how many years? Humor me. Hugh sighed, still holding back some of his breath. 5. Aaron nodded, almost as if Hugh was showing him some sort of trophy. Any kids? Hugh shook his head. We tried. Tried? Hell, we all try. That's the fun part. We lost the baby, Hugh clarified in a somber tone. Aaron looked at him coldly. Now tell me where my wife is right now, or... She's fine, Hugh. Jesus, he said, shaking his head. It's you that you should be worried about. He nudged the cross on his desk ever so slightly to the left and revealed a small black intercom. One beep from me, and my little servants out there would tear you limb from limb if I wanted. No, they wouldn't. Hugh shook his head. That's against their book. Aaron slammed at the table with his hand and roared with a fit of forced laughter. They don't read the book. I already told you that. It makes for one hell of a prop, though. A great thing to swear by or use as a coaster. But they never actually read the damn thing. Besides, you wouldn't be the first. He grinned. Aaron glanced from Hugh over to the closet door in the back corner of the room, cast in the deep stain of shadowy black, and then back to him. Go ahead, he smiled, nodding toward the door. Hugh cleared his throat and hesitantly stood, not breaking his stare with the stranger. He crisscrossedly walked over to the door, rapping his knuckles along the cool handle, and twisted. He pulled it open, and was hit with a sheen of metallic red right in the eyes. A Coca-Cola ice chest. "Let me assure you, Mr. What was it?" Hugh was fine. "Well, let me assure you, Hugh, that cooler isn't full of Coke. And the good residents of Armageddon, which, mind you, is the name of the city where Christ returns, are booze-free. Nah, that cooler, last time I checked, is home to Officer Dwight McMahon. Or what's left of him, anyways. I caught the prick trying to coerce some of my followers to leave. Or, as I told them, he was trying to divide the church. Titus, chapter 3. He smiled, standing from his squeaky chair. See, long as I spit out Bible quotes and parables, these dumb asses will do anything I tell them. And that includes making you Officer McMahon's roommate." Hugh lifted the lid of the cooler with his shoe and glared into the dark box. He couldn't see much, but what he could, a mess of red-stained, tattered blue fabric and hunks of flesh that drew in a nearby fly, sank his stomach into his knees. "They almost got away, too," Aaron said from over his shoulder. Hugh took a glance back at him and watched the man open a desk drawer, fiddling around with whatever was inside. He looked back at the cooler and yanked his foot away as he tasted the sour metallic stench on his tongue. "The ones with kids always want to leave. I mean, wives are bad enough, but kids completely wreck my operation out here, man. Now I know what Paul meant when he said it was better not to marry. Except in your case." Hugh thought again of Leah and spun around on his heel, but was immediately met with the steel edge of a blade directly into his gut. He wailed in pain as Aaron smothered his mouth with his hand. It smelled like booze and cheeseburgers. Hugh nearly tripped over the cooler as his back slammed into the closet wall, and he was dragged back to the floor. Aaron let go of the knife and kneeled before the aching stranger, staring down into his bloodshot eyes. "You asked me what I wanted with you and your wife," he said, biting a hangnail off his thumb and rising to his feet. "To be perfectly honest, Hugh, I want to fuck your wife. Ever heard of Immaculate Conception?" Hugh grunted as a blade was yanked from his body, warmth seeping into his Saturday's finest. He tried to blurt something out, but only hot spit flung from his clenched teeth. Aaron shook his head. Come on now. Have an open mind about it." Part 2. Void Salesman. It was a cold day in hell on the day that was hotter than a lake of fire could ever be. The day that Aaron Buckley decided to open his front door to a complete stranger, and a black one at that. It was the middle of July in Tecumseh, Oklahoma, and Satan's sphincter was hovering over Pottawatomie County like your fat uncle's ass over the crapper at the chili cook-off. Suffice it to say, it was a hot day that day in mid-July, and for a young black fella such as the one on Aaron Buckley's porch to be standing there, suit and tie and black skin and all, it took a hell of a dedication to whatever he was slinging. Probably a load of horse shit. The first thing that caught Aaron's attention as soon as he opened the door was the shiny object in the young man's left hand. He thought it might have been the shiny sheen of one of those golden gildings on the page edges of a Bible, but it wasn't. It was a cup. The second thing that caught Aaron's attention was a piece of paper taped to his front door and blowing in the non-existent breeze. He was about to berate the stranger about plastering shit on his house, but when he read the bold in text, eviction notice, He realized it wasn't his house anymore, and that black fella was not the one who had put it there. He sighed and snatched it. "All right, what do you want, Rando?" The young man took a timid step back and then collected himself. "Rando?" His voice was softer than Aaron might have expected, considering his build. He might have considered him a gentle giant, but he wasn't that big. "Yeah, you're a rando. As in a random-ass blackie in a white neighborhood soliciting what? Cups? Solicitation is illegal here." The young man looked from Aaron down to the chalice-typed object in his hand, and then back at him. He was flustered. No, I'm not soliciting. I'm not selling the cup. You sold the cup. You are Aaron Buckley, right?" "Yeah, I'm Aaron Buckley," Aaron said, crossing his arms across his chest as he leaned against the doorframe. "And I don't sell cups. So you must have the wrong Aaron Buckley, Rando." "You worked at the little antique store in Selena, right? Second Coming?" "Nah," Aaron said, droning it out. "I worked at the thrift store in Selena. Antique stores sell old garbage. Thrift stores sell new garbage." "Why?" he asked, glancing down to the cup. "Did I sell you that?" He pointed to the cup. "No," the young man said, lifting it to his stomach. "You sold it to a friend of mine, Clive Richards." "I don't remember every inbred that bought you socks from me." "Well, he went to the little church that's attached to the store. He and I worked there, First Baptist." "Rando, there are 60 First Baptists from here to fucking McDonald's. They can't all be the first." The young man swallowed. "So I take it you didn't attend?" Aaron shook his head, but that wasn't entirely true. On a few occasions, he had found himself in that chapel, usually on his late mother's birthday. Sometimes he'd even bow his head and close his eyes, even if it were just a formality. But as soon as that shimmering offering plate came around, he was gone. "Well, like I said, you sold my friend Clive this cup," the young man said, and again he lifted it. It was chest high now. "What about it? I sold a lot of shit like that at 5 and dime." The young man blew a hot, humorous breath through his teeth. "Well, sir, he paid you $250 for it." Aaron's eyebrows raised, and suddenly he remembered what the young man was talking about. "Oh, yeah, the Prophet Kid." The young man did a half nod and smiled. He and Clive had gotten into many arguments over the usage of such a term. Theologically speaking, he didn't believe there were any more prophets. And Clive, however, believed full well that there were, and that he was one of them. "What a fucking idiot," Aaron said, grinning from ear to ear and shaking his head like a wet dog. "He really thought it was the Holy Grail," the young man finished, nodding as he did so. Aaron looked at him, stupefied. "Well, then, what the hell are you doing here, then? You want a refund?" "Sorry, no returns," Aaron said, and he began to shut the door. No, the young man said. I want to know how you did it." "Did what?" "Sell him the cup." Aaron chuckled to himself. "No offense, kid, but your friend was a dumbass. Simple as that." "I know," the young man said, scratching behind his neck. "But he's not that much of a fool." "I don't know about that, Rando." "It says made in Taiwan on the bottom, sir." "And that proves my point, kid." Yeah, and it also proves mine, the young man said, cutting him off. Which is? The young man sighed. Which is that you're quite a salesman, sir. You're persuasive. And? Aaron asked. He already knew he was persuasive. He sold a cup for $250,000. And I want to be too, the young man admitted, breathing out another hot breath. All my life I felt called to witness. Witness what? The young man rephrased. To evangelize. I want to be a missionary, sir. Aaron scoffed. Why? You want to go back to Africa? The young man swallowed and shrugged. It's what God has convinced me, sir. He wants me to do. But if I'm being honest, sir, I'm not very convincing myself. He blushed, then straightened up. But you are. Aaron settled into the wall, his face grown grim. Don't get any funny ideas, kid. I'm not one for charity cases. This isn't a charity, the young man said, more confidently than anything else he had said prior. It's a job. Ever heard of tithes and offerings? Chapter 9. So you're telling me, Aaron said, puffing a bellow of smoke and waving the cig in the air. The church paid for you to drive your ass 3 hours to some rando's house in the middle of nowhere, just for him to tell you how to preach something that he doesn't even believe? Not preach, the young black man said, now seated across from him on the couch, a single overnight bag placed on the crusty cushion beside him. Convince. Same thing. You want to sell Jesus. No, Jesus isn't for sale. Everything's for sale. This damn house is for sale, and I'm still living in it. Was living in it. Point is, everybody's buying into something these days. But God's love is free, the stranger said, hands clasped. Aaron shrugged, leaning back in the other, just as old and crusty couch. I'm not buying it, but I can sure as hell sell it, he said, taking another nicotine breath. So, how much are you and your good folks over at First Baptist willing to cough up for my services? The young man straightened up and scooted his bag closer to him on the couch. I brought $20 with me, sir. $20? Aaron said, furrowing his brow. The young man across from him nodded softly and licked his lips, squeezing the bag in his right hand impulsively. If that's not enough, sir, I could. 35, and not a dime less. The young man nodded in agreement, nervously, and loosened his grip on the bag. I can do that. You're damn right you can. You can also pay me half now and half when we're finished. The young stranger across from him, legs crossed, agreed with a nod. When will we start, sir? Aaron chuckled. We already have. Lesson number 1, Rando. Confidence is key. Say what you're talking about boldly, even if you don't know what you're talking about, and people will listen, he said, blowing smoke. Now, give me that 20. It would be 17.5, sir. Now you're getting it, Aaron grinned, and as the stranger stretched out the cash and some kind of book beneath it, he tossed his cig to the carpet and stomped on it with his boot, grinding it in. The hell's this? He said, palming the cash and raising the Bible in his hand. It's the Bible. I know that, Aaron said, not taking his eyes off of him despite the glare of the setting sun outside. Why are you giving me one? The young man shrugged. Consider it a free gift. Aaron nodded. Lesson number 2 is that a gift is something somebody actually wants. And speaking of wants, kid, you hungry?" The young man shook his head, somewhat defeated. "No, just tired." "Ain't we all? Tell you what, I'm starved. Why don't you get yourself settled in and I'll grab a bite to eat?" Aaron squeezed the green paper in his fist and realized it would be the first time in over 2 weeks that he could actually afford grub other than the free Chinese samples at the mall. No thanks to the book in his other hand. Okay, sure, sir," the young black man said, his squinty eyes wondering why a complete stranger would entrust his home and everything in it to a colored unfamiliar. The answer to Aaron was quite simple, really. There was nothing in this god-forsaken place to steal, and as for the place itself, well, the bank already did its robbery just fine. "Good," Aaron said, kicking open the front door with his foot. "We'll continue your, lessons first thing tomorrow morning. Oh," he stopped, turning back before leaving his home. "The toilet's broken. So, if you gotta piss, just go in the corner, I guess. And if you gotta shit, wipe your ass with that slip from the bank, would ya?" Chapter 10. For the third time in less than 20 miles, Aaron found himself pulled off the main highway yet again and back into the emergency lane. The catalyst for the pit stops was quite simple, really. Dosing the windshield of his hunk of junk and the final remnants of his watered-down Coke with coat-down ice. It wouldn't be long before more of that sugary smuts formed on the glass and made the voyage nearly impossible in the dark. But as he understood it, sometimes you gotta make a mess in order to clean one, even if that means starting up a vicious cycle, which he had, hence the going on 4 pit stops. He plopped back into the driver's seat and watched the barely brown streaks race to the non-working wipers before putting the clunker in first gear and rolling back down the main highway, which was surprisingly dead considering it was the main highway after all. Aaron could still taste the flavor of food court hamburger on his lips, and washing it down with his washed-down Coke, the thought about the change he had plucked straight out of the fountain beside his table, and penny-shaped wishes from schmucks that could spare him. In his pocket, for all he knew, might have been the wish that some Joe would find love, or a prayer, perhaps, that some other guy's mom might not die of polio. And yet, despite what the stranger bunking it at his foreclosed house was spewing, they weren't in God's pocket, but his. It seemed that for but a few fleeting moments, God was in his heaven, and all was right with the world. At least the world that occupied Aaron Buckley's Rambler. That was, of course, until that rumbling Rambler's beams shone brightly over the highway's hump and onto the toll booth that joined wherever he was coming from to wherever he was going, which was the way back home. He recognized the booth almost instantly, and for a good long second, as he stomped on the brakes with his foot, he wondered just how many of his hard-earned dollars he had coughed up into the hands of the Kansas Turnpike Authority. Probably a handful, and if such a hand did exist, one that epitomized the sheer grip and willpower of the Kansas Turnpike, it belonged to Mildred. He never did catch her last name, and it wasn't as if he wanted to, because Mildred, as her slanted name tag labeled her so, was the only woman that seemed to occupy that toll booth, always casting the dull yellow blend of the street lamps in that 2x2 box's internal glow. She was a large enough woman that she sometimes appeared to be oozing out of the booth's 2 glass windows, and no matter the time of day, she was always as crusty as a sardine sandwich and didn't smell far off from one either. She was usually nose-deep in a nice, thick book, which was either something as plump or old as she was, usually something by H.G. Wells, or something a tad plumper and older, like the Bible. It was on that note that Aaron's eyes dashed the passenger seat of the Rambler, which was still frozen in place on the highway, Still seated just where he had thrown it, amidst a sea of cigarette burn holes and unpaid traffic tickets, was the rando's Bible. His gift. A gift indeed. He grabbed it by the back cover and lifted it like a sopping wet rag, only instead of a drizzle of water pouring onto the seat, not that he would have cared, a flurry of pages began rippling through the air until he caught his thumb on one of them and tossed a good book into his lap. A click of the overhead reading light, which was finally living up to its name, with his finger revealed the words Proverbs 21 right there in front of him. Yada, 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 he read aloud to himself. Better to dwell in a corner than in a house shared with a contentious woman. Ain't that the truth? He grunted, before flipping through the Bible again, this time the passage a bit more topical. And he asserted that fact by saying out loud and to himself, Bingo! Still, there was something inside him. Call it doubt or maybe just an extremely acute sense of stage fright that gave the weary traveler second thought. It was only 15 cents after all, but then again, that was basically a hamburger from McDonald's. And boy, you bet your sweet ass that 2 toothpick-fulls of Kung Pao chicken was nowhere near the satisfaction of a food court hamburger. So, whether or not it was the quaking of his stomach or his ride, Aaron didn't speed through the toll booth that night. He stopped, and just as he expected, there was Mildred, face first into a novel as thick as a brick like she was wolfing down a hot fudge sundae, which she probably did do before her shift. Evening, Mildred, Aaron cheesed in just about the most sing-songy way he could. Mildred, whose face had actually gotten more disinterested after being pulled from between the pages, wasn't having any of his cheese, and with a figure such as hers, it was probably for the best, Aaron thought. Still, he continued smiling. You know the drill, Mr. Buckley, she said, lips smacking like a bullfrog. 15 cents. Aaron sighed and began digging into the cup holder beside him before jerking his head over his shoulder to confirm what his fingers were trying to tell him. Shit. What? Mildred said, her eyes halfway rolled back into her head. I don't have the He stopped himself from cursing. Change. Mildred's face widened, somehow wider than it was a moment before. Sure. I'm serious, Aaron said, his fingers digging around in the empty hole. I must have put all my cash in the offering plate on Sunday. Mildred, peering over the barricade she had made with her copy of The Time Machine, raised a fuzzy, unkempt brow at the distant stranger. You go to church? Aaron nodded with a gleeful chuckle. Yeah, and I know the Lord needs the money, but he ought to know I do, too. Mildred nodded with an expression blended with agreement and suspicion. What church? Aaron paused. First Baptist. Mildred nodded again, this time with both fuzzy brows raised. Big congregation? Aaron shrugged. We keep the lights on. I wouldn't say we're big, but pastor's signal, he said, while glancing to and from a nearby stop sign. It says we've got big heart and a lot of prayerful members. Is there anything I can pray for you, Mildred? Aaron batted his eyes at the old bat, and somehow, the ends of Mildred's lips curled into what could be called a smile, or at least one you might find on the face of a frog. Well, I must say I'm a bit surprised, Mr. Buckley. Please, call me Aaron, Aaron said with a nod. Aaron, Mildred repeated in a softer tone. I must say I didn't know you were a believer. Aaron shrugged. I'd like to think that I'll be known by my fruit, he said, wondering whatever the hell that meant. Do you? Mildred sighed and caught her breath in the air. "Of course, I just, didn't realize." Her voice trailed off. Aaron leaned further out the window and smiled again, wider than perhaps he had ever in his life before, as he slapped his junker. "How about that prayer?" Mildred bowed her head with a soft smile. "Right, it's just that, well, I guess you could say it's kind of a tall order." Aaron shrugged. "Name it." Mildred hemmed and hawed for a couple of moments that seemed to ooze by like maple syrup. Finally, she spoke. "Well, it's just that, well," Mildred said, her voice cracking and her eyes beginning to tear up. "It's just that my daughter is sick," she said, holding back a sob. "She's been sick for years and I don't know what to do about it. The doctors won't tell me what's the matter and it's hard to sleep." She sniffled, clearing her throat. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't worry about it," Aaron said, cutting her off. "I'll pray for you." He smiled. Mildred nodded, head drooped. "Thank you." Aaron nodded back. "Anytime. And you let your daughter know she's got prayers coming her way, okay?" The old bag snorted a wheezy chortle. "I will," she said, her watery eyes wandering down the open road. "Oh, and don't worry about the 15 cents. It's on me, Aaron." And she said his name like she was talking to an old friend. Aaron tipped his head. "Why, thank you," he grinned. And with that, he let his foot off the brake and switched into first gear, side-eyeing the tiny Bible in the passenger seat, flipped open to Matthew chapter 7, and dropping the dime and nickel back into the cup holder with a rattle. Chapter 11. It was nearly 11 before Aaron arrived back at his, well, now the bank's home, coins still jingling in his pocket like Christmas bells and travel-sized Bible in hand. The dim light from the porch cut through the living room like butter as Aaron squeaked open the door, and there, head resting on the armrest of the couch, was a young black man, eyes darting from the ceiling to Aaron. "Thought you'd be asleep by now," Aaron said, strutting across the room and plopping on the opposite couch with a crisp crunch and another squeak. The young man sighed and laced his hands between the cushion and his head. "Yeah, I can't sleep." "Lot on your mind?" Aaron popped off one of his boots and let out a groan, before turning to the other foot and doing the same. "Yeah," the young man said. He was a young man of few words. "Same here, kid," Aaron said, and the young man looked over at him, noticing the Bible tucked between his fingers and his rear, and he perked up. "You reading it, sir?" Aaron's face wrinkled, but then he realized what the stranger was talking about. "Oh, yeah," he then said. And, it's good." He lied. He rolled over in the cushions to face him and blew out a warm breath. "Why is it that Jesus had so many people that followed him, you think?" The young man sat up a little. "Maybe it has to do with what you said earlier. Confidence?" "Yeah, but he was a bum, won't he? A hippie?" "Yeah, but he was bold. He had God's authority." Aaron nodded and bit his lip. "And what authority is that?" The young man swallowed. "All of it?" Aaron nodded again against the couch. "Yeah, I used to believe that, kid. But then I lost somebody." "Your wife?" The young man sat up straighter. Aaron shook his head. "My mother. She was a good Catholic all her life, and I prayed every night to the big man upstairs that he'd save her. But he never did. She gave a lot of money to a fella like you, but he didn't even care about her, and clearly, God didn't either." The young man swallowed. Maybe God couldn't interfere. He gave us free will. Aaron wiped his face. Then what kind of fucking authority is that? The young man nodded. I know what it's like to lose someone, sir. But God doesn't kill people, He saves them. And that's what I want to do too. That man that scammed your mom, he wasn't like me. A whiff of repugnant air filled Aaron in the kid's nostrils, meaning either the black mold in the bathroom was getting worse, or that the sanitation building down the road was cooking up its nightly plate of rotten eggs and hash. The young man coughed, and Aaron licked his lips. So, who'd you lose? The young man lowered his sleeve from his nose. My father and my mother last year. Sorry to hear it. The kid nodded. Thanks. Were they, like you? You know, with all the church stuff? The kid shrugged. Dad was. Ma loved the Lord too, but she was always hot-headed, kinda like you. Hot-headed? Aaron repeated. The kid nodded. Yeah. Bold. Aaron nodded. If I were that bold kid, I'd have more of that authority you've been talking about. The young man shrugged. I guess that's why we pray that God would conform us into the image of His Son. Aaron agreed, but not in an agreeable kind of way. Chapter 12. It was only then, which happened to be 6:46 on a Tuesday morning, that it dawned on Aaron why it was called a monkey suit. It was dawn, and even though the sun hadn't even reared its head, it was 90 in the shade, which just so happened to be inside the suit just beneath his pits. When he picked at them, trying to fan himself in the process, he really did begin to feel like a primate, a monkey picking lice from its fur. And to think the black missionary didn't even believe in evolution. It was his suit. As he combed his fingers through his thick hair, again like a monkey, the door before him swung open and the light of the morning sun filled the dark house. The man inside, whose shirt was halfway unbuttoned, or halfway buttoned depending on how you looked at it, squinted and immediately pushed the door halfway shut. Sorry, sir, we're not interested, thank you, he said, gritting his teeth against the sunlight. They were a bit yellow, and yet at the same time bright enough to reflect some of that light back at Aaron, whose gritting teeth were also showing. Thank me, Aaron said, emphasizing each word as he did. I didn't even buy you home yet. The man at the door did a little backstep, stepping on some kind of rattling baby toy and then undid it. We, aren't selling the house, he said, asking more than saying it. But you misheard me, sir, Aaron said, using that customer service voice he picked up back at the thrift shop. I buy homes, not houses. What's the difference? Aaron clasped his hands together and took a breath in. A house is not a home without a family. The man at the door shot a few confused glances across his yard, and then focused on the stranger on his porch. So, you want to buy my family? And the house, Aaron added. The man covered his mouth as he blew a chuckle into his hand and then shook his head. We're not for sale, mister. Oh, but you are, Aaron nodded. It was a Sullivan nod, and against his will, it seemed, the man at the door nodded back before again returning to shaking his head. I don't understand what you're... In fact, you already were. You were bought with a price. 1 Corinthians. As soon as he heard it, the man blew a bellow of breath from his gut at the sound of the biblical reference and dipped his head in understanding. "Oh, I see," he said, flashing a toothy grin. "You're one of those fellas from the church down the street." "Actually," Aaron said, cutting him off, "my kingdom is not of this world." At the sound of that, the young black wannabe missionary, who, mind you, was standing a ways off to the side of Aaron on the homeowner's lawn, shadowing, if you will, swallowed a sharp breath. It wasn't a loud gulp, but surely Aaron knew it bothered him, even though it was from his holy book. The man at the door raised his brow and drummed his fingers along the door, which was still clenched in his hand. "You some kind of kook?" Aaron laughed. "Kooks are full of bullshit, sir. I, however, have no bullshit. All I have is a warning." "Which is?" The man at the door was intrigued, if not curious. The stranger's brashness had caught him off guard. Aaron's face grew narrow. "Your family is on the market, sir. Your home. And if you don't let God make an offer, the devil will snatch you, your wife, your children, and the baby up." Aaron snapped as he uttered that final line, and it sent a shiver down the man's spine, he could tell. "What's the offer?" the man asked. There was a tremble in his cadence which brought a smile to Aaron's lips and caused his eyes to dash to the black missionary beside him before snapping back to the man at the door. This guy was buying it hook, line, and sinker. "The offer is... believe." "Believe? Believe," Aaron nodded. "And you'll receive." The man at the door nodded silently, smacked his lips, and asked, "Are you... somebody?" Aaron chuckled a bit. "Aren't we all?" The man shook his head. "Somebody, you know. Special?" Aaron nodded, stopped, and looked the man in the eyes. "Who do you say I am?" Chapter 13. "What in the world was that?" the wannabe missionary asked, trudging behind Aaron through the uncut grass. "What in the world was what?" Aaron snapped. That's not what we discussed." "Yeah, well, I did my homework, kid," Aaron said, raising the pocket-sized Bible the man had given him and waving it in the static air. He unbuttoned the monkey suit and ripped it off his sweat-covered body, evident by the stains all over his undershirt. He tossed the half-soaked jacket at the stranger, who caught it apprehensively. "How the hell do you even read this thing?" he asked, throwing the baby Bible at the young man too. "I've read fortune cookies bigger than that thing, and at least they've got lucky numbers on the back." Aaron slunk inside his junker, which was 2 skips from the scrapyard at that point, and rumbled it to a start. The young man opened the passenger side door and hopped inside, jacket and mini Bible in hand. The young man sat silently as the cool air, smelling of nicotine and freon, blasted his sweat-ridden face before he said, "Believe. That's what you told him. Believe?" "Was I wrong?" The young man sighed. "You didn't even tell him what to believe in. Who to believe in." "Doesn't matter." "Yes, it matters." That was the first time the young man lost his cool, which was understandable considering the quite literal heat of the moment. Aaron stole some of the cold air through his nostrils. "You know what doesn't matter, kid? You and your opinions. I woke my ass up at the ass crack of dawn just to coach your lousy ass on how to do your own damn job. So, the next time God calls you to the mission field," Aaron said, air quotes raised, "don't pick up. Send his almighty ass to voicemail." The young black man sighed. The car was cooler now, and so was he. You shouldn't say things like that, sir. Well, you came to me, Rando. This is who I am. My name is Clifford. A shot of breath fired out from Aaron's nose. Well, I wouldn't remember. You're about as dull as a dishwasher, kid. People like excitement. You want to sell? Excite 'em. We're not selling anything. Oh, but we are, Aaron said, turning to look directly at his passenger. We are void salesmen. Salesmen of the void. That little aching feeling that something's missing? That's what we sell to. Your dumb-ass friend from Selena didn't want to buy a cup off of me. He wanted to feel special. That excitement was missing from his life. And when I appealed to that void, he bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. That's all your religion is, Cliff. Appealing to the void. Clifford let out a sigh and bit his lips so tightly he could taste yesterday's lunch. Yet, rather than excusing the leftovers and sinking his teeth into Aaron, he simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded-up paper, no bigger than a business card. The hell is that? Clifford didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and offered it to Aaron, who snatched it up. It was a crumpled mess of a thing. Must have been in that pocket for God knows how long. On it was a string of letters that spelled out a Bible verse. Acts 4:12. Nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Aaron flipped the thing over, and on the other side was the name Jesus Christ, written in the same bold lettering you see on liquidation signs, which meant only one thing. The church was going out of business. Sounded about right to him. Strangest of all, though, was what was doodled next to the name. A clear blue sky, and in front of it a person. Jesus H. Christ himself, no doubt. What was unusual to Aaron, however, was that a big black dot was covering his face, haloed by a glow that resembled how a child would draw the sun. What's that shit on his face? Aaron said, flicking the card. And Clifford cleared his throat. It's there to keep the second commandment. No graven images. It's Jesus. I thought you guys loved the guy. It's not Jesus, it's an image of him. And? Clifford sighed. And it's not Christ, it's a depiction. And we're not supposed to worship something that isn't him, including depictions of him. Aaron leaned back and tightened his grip on the steering wheel, letting a big huff of breath from his nose meet with the air from the vents as he chuckled. That's the stupidest shit I've ever heard. And Clifford shrugged. It's called a tract. It's what we use to witness. Witness? Aaron clearly didn't listen the first time he explained it. Tell people about Jesus. Last night you asked me what I wanted out of this, and I told you. I want to save somebody. Not scare them or sell them something. I want to save them. Aaron bobbed his head up and down, and without a word, shifted into drive and let his hunk of junk roll up to the next driveway. He watched Clifford's face crumple into a wad of confusion as the missionary watched him back, easing onto the brakes and pushing the shifter into park, letting the shitter bounce once before it stopped. He took the tract in his fingers, leaned past Clifford, and popped open the glove box. Inside, there were a handful of stray cigarettes, including unpaid parking tickets and a worn-looking Smith & Wesson still sporting a price tag of $49. Can never be too careful these days, he winked, and thrust the tract inside. Especially with colored folk like you sleeping on my couch. And Clifford couldn't tell whether or not Aaron was joking, but either way, he didn't smile. Let's see it then, Aaron said, with a flash of his not-so-pearly whites. See what? The young black man swallowed. Aaron squinted back at him, never once wiping the smirk from his cheeks. You and those tracts of yours save somebody. Chapter 14. With a considerable amount of hesitation, Clifford popped open the passenger side door and thrust himself into the heat of the Oklahoma sun, tugging that monkey suit over his head like he was a modest and naked turtle. As he spun around on the sole of his feet, he couldn't help but feel his own, non-shoe-covered soul, somewhere between his heart and his chest, shrivel. He hadn't had a successful witness at this point in his life, and he was a few years shy of 30. He'd always prayed that God would use him, but it seemed that the only people that did were practically everyone else. By the time his mind caught up with his legs, he was standing on the front porch, and 2 knocks in with a third on the way, if not for the older woman that emerged from behind the door, looking as if she had just freshly awoken from sleep, though herself not hardly fresh at all. "You know the bell works, right?" she said, scratching the back of her head and squinting at the bright sunlight that shadowed out the already darkened figure. It wasn't a common sight to see a black man standing on your front porch at 9 in the morning, or, for that matter, any time. Clifford glanced at the doorbell on the nearby wall and then back at the woman at the door, who seemed to already have reservations about opening it in the first place. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to wake you." "Well, I'm awoken, so let me hear it. You're not with that godforsaken Eisenhower campaign, are you?" "President Eisenhower?" "Yeah, that's what you'd like to think." Clifford swallowed. "No, I'm here from the church, ma'am. First Baptist. I have something I want to give you. Unless it's a Social Security check, I don't want it. That's about the only good thing Eisenhower's got going for him." I'm not with the campaign, ma'am," Clifford said. He stopped and thought about what Aaron had said, and brushed his hands against the damp suit. "I'm with God." "God?" the woman clacked. "Yes," Clifford said, straightening up a bit. "And he has a message for you." Clifford reached into his pocket and pulled out another of the tracts, this one slightly bent in the corner. He smiled and reached out his hand, and the slip of printed-on paper, and the woman took it. "Nor is there," she began, reading the verse aloud, "salvation in any other, for there—" She paused. "Are you a Jehovah's Witness or something?" Clifford grinned and shook his head. "No, ma'am, I'm from the First Baptist." "Which one?" "That's exactly what I said." Clifford turned around, and standing just behind him was Aaron, sporting the sweaty undershirt and reflecting the grin that was quickly wiped upon Clifford's cheeks. "And who the hell are you?" the woman asked with crossed arms. "I'm the senior pastor of First Baptist, matter of fact." "Well, you don't look like a pastor much." "And you don't look a day over 45. But that don't mean we ain't what we are," he lied. The woman stepped further into the sunlight. "Are you being smart with me?" "Hardly," Aaron said, hand raised. "But if you were smart, ma'am, you'd listen to me." "And why the hell would I do that?" Aaron's eyes drifted from her wedding ring to the single Dodge parked in the driveway and then back to the woman. "Because I have a message from your husband." The woman's eyes grew to the size of tangerines, and she stumbled forward a bit, her voice now softer around the edges. "From David?" Aaron nodded. Clifford clasped his sweat-covered arm, but Aaron jerked it away and touched the woman on the shoulder. "He's watching over you." "Ma'am, this man is lying to you," Clifford said. Both the woman, eyes now swollen red with tears, and Aaron turned their heads to face him. Aaron's now shaking to and fro. "Are you really telling a lonely, widowed woman that her husband ain't watching over her? How sad," he said, his jaw setting into place. "Of all people, I thought you'd understand how it feels to lose someone so close." I do," Clifford said, glancing at the woman who was crying now. "But you're lying to this woman, Aaron." Aaron straightened up against the heat, Maybe the real lie, Cliff, is the one you've been telling yourself all these years. Maybe you can't save anybody, kid, because you ain't saved yourself." Clifford, hearing the woman's cries, couldn't help but tear up himself. "I have assurance of my salvation." Aaron nodded, still holding the woman against him. "Not so sure anymore, are you? Dad's dead, Ma's dead. You're the only one left to convince yourself of that." Clifford turned from the porch, wiping a mixture of sweat and tears from his cheeks, and began storming down the road back to his car. He was finished with whatever this had become, and Aaron could keep the $17.50. Aaron, still on the porch, widowed woman in hand, watched as the young black man staggered away. He grinned. "Fine. I didn't need you anymore anyway." Part 3. Maranatha. Chapter 15. From his side of the king mattress, Hugh could still see the empty room across the hall, halfway brushed a shade of baby blue. He hated that color now, but the missus refused to revert it back to the way it was before. Said the beige made her sad, and that if they'd hold out hope one day, God willing, that tint of blue would live up to its name. God willing. He didn't believe that phrase anymore, and if there was a God, he thought, he certainly wasn't willing. Not anymore, at least. But that didn't stop his wife from trying to persuade him. Those long nights where she ought to have been on her side of the king, she was kneeling on the living room rug praying to him, asking him one more time to take the beige away. As for Hugh, it wasn't so much that he wanted those little summer vacations of theirs, but rather he needed them, so he didn't have to see the blue anymore. That's what the sunglasses were for. Those shaded spectacles would make the bluest of skies as gray as a hound, both the dog and the bus. And as for the Mrs. Bleach blonde hair, well, that was gray too. Gray as the morning and all of those billboards peeked through the thickets of oak and pecan trees, some of which were about those very things. Pecans. Others, not ballyhooing nuts, were still just as, usually peddling the same three things: sex, boots, and Jesus. And it was usually in that order, too. "Did you take your DES this morning?" Hugh asked, nudging his half-asleep wife. The barrage of sex-related imagery must have jogged his memory, and that memory was the pill that Dr. Nathan had put his wife on some 5 months prior. Diethylstill something trol was prescribed in cases of estrogen deficiency, which would have explained the lack of pregnancy success and the miscarriage. Little did they know, however, that old Des was also the culprit. On the occasion, however, Leah would forget about the medication, and so for their 5th wedding anniversary, Hugh bought his beloved bride a shiny golden Angelus wristwatch. It wasn't an actual gold, but it was actually an alarm watch, perfect for a forgetful bride. Mrs. Leah Birchman rubbed her head back and forth along the headrest as she slowly drifted from her deep sleep, groaning with a cracking voice. "No, I took it last night," she said, "while I was packing." "What time?" She thought about it. "Midnight?" "Well, just don't forget to set your alarm. We should be in St. Louis by 10 if we don't make any major pit stops, but just in case." Leah nodded, prying open her eyes against the harsh sunlight, and set the alarm for midnight. She then sat up a bit, watching as another sex-laden sign approached on the right. "I guess sex sells these days," Hugh said, as the reflection of the adult billboard washed over the windshield. His wife, who was also looking out the window now at the 50-foot-long pinup girl with nearly 20-foot-long legs that led up to a plump waist, wagged her head as the sight passed, in exchange for a banner promoting discounted footwear. Hugh didn't even need to look over at her to know that his better half wasn't amused at the unholy sight. "Just keep your eyes on the road, Hugh," she said. He was unable to tell if her tone was that of a playfulness or genuine bitterness. He cleared his throat. "Oh, come on, baby. You know she doesn't have anything on you." The missus scoffed. "Yeah, okay, sure," she said sarcastically, shaking her head against the glass. "I'm serious, babe," Hugh said, turning his head to catch a glimpse of her pumped-up hairdo. She was a 6 at best, and even 6s need a good paycheck. "What she needs is Jesus." The car went silent for a moment, until another billboard faded into view along the horizon. "Well, speak of the guy. There he is," Hugh said, as a sun-bleached image of the Prince of Peace zipped on by. "And there he goes. But don't worry, he'll be back in about 5 miles. After about 2, which included yet another sightsee of similarly risque road sign to the 50-footer, the monotony of the highway adverts was broken by a dust-speckled little plaque reading, "Service Station 1 mile." Hugh rolled his neck. "What do you say we pull off and get a couple of Cokes and take a stretch? Besides, the car needs gas and I need to use the John." The missus yawned and nodded silently against the window, lifting her head as if from a catnap and watching as the buggy rolled off the main highway and onto one of the exits, following the trail until the rinky-dink service station appeared just beyond a bundle of brown bushes. It was a modest station with 2 pumps. Truth be told, the place could have used 2 pumps of degreaser. One stray cigarette butt, Hugh thought, and the whole place would have gone up in flames with all that gas gunk along the ground. And that black fella just sitting on his ass and watching them pull up to the handle wasn't doing jack. Until, at least, the car rolled to a stop and Hugh hopped out, waving him over. "I'll be right back, babe," Hugh said. His wife flashed him a modest, lippy smile, and he took off for the restrooms, labeled men, ladies, and colored. At the same time, the colored man with the rolled-up denim jacket and matching cap, both smeared in grease and gas, stepped out from the shade of the station store and made his way over to the pump. To Mr. and Mrs. Birchman, and practically every other stranger that rolled themselves into that station, the man was nothing more than just another colored fella. However, as far as labels go, his grease-stained name tag would have indicated that the fella had a name. Clifford. "Good morning," Mrs. Birchman said with a smile and a nod as the man lifted the nozzle. He watched her pleasant demeanor through the open window, and with a nod of his own began to, as his boss would say, "fill her up." And aside from that filling her up, the place was quiet, with only the distant bustling of cars on the highway and the singing of morning birds filling the silence. "How long have you been working here?" Mrs. Birchman said, shattering the silence and turning her head to face the stranger through the rear and driver's side window. He sighed to himself. The last thing Clifford wanted was all that small talk stuff. He would have rather listened to his boss bitch and moan about his work ethic, or hear the same 5 tunes playing over the radio than talk to this woman. Unfortunately, he was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and by that, he figured between a pesky white lady and losing his job. About 2 years," he grumbled. Mrs. Birchman nodded. "Long time." Clifford nodded back, licked his lips, and continued pumping. Mrs. Birchman, watching the man as he worked, couldn't help the feeling bubbling up inside of her. Maybe it was a bit of pity for the man, or maybe it was a gratitude for him standing out in the heat and filling their tank. But for whatever reason, Mrs. Birchman was inclined to reach into her handbag, a little kiss-locked thing of yellow fabric, and pull out one of those folded pamphlets from inside it, the ones that sat out on the greeting table during Sunday morning service. She took in a jittery breath, and then the handle clicked against the buggy. The tank was full. All done, ma'am. Clifford nodded through the window. He turned and hung up the handle and wiped the sweat across his brow, making his way for the store when the woman called out for him. He turned on his heel and bent down, his face filling the void left by rolled-down glass. I wanted to give this to you, sir, the woman said, offering something up to him. He thought it was a tip at first, until he noticed it to be some sort of folded-up piece of paper, minus, of course, a dead president's face on it. No doubt garbage to be tossed on behalf of another cheap-ass white lady. But it wasn't garbage. I just wanted you to know that, Jesus loves you. Clifford uncrinkled the paper, and there, in his hands, was a familiar sight. His tract. The same verse, same font, same blotted-out picture of Jesus. It was photocopied, no doubt. But it was his. His eyes lifted to the woman, and unable to say anything else, Clifford's voice cracked into a quiet, "Thank you." It was as if on cue that Hugh passed across the windshield, one hand scratching his chin, the other pulling up his straight zipper. His eyes were on his wife, but hers were on the man looking through the window, and soon his were too. He could see his face, his eyes, and that God-forsaken Bible thing, as he called it. He wanted to apologize to the man on account of his better half, but all he could do was return the thank you as he passed him and plopped into the buggy. He swallowed and turned the key. "Did you go, honey?" he asked, now turning to see his wife. She shook her head. "I'm good." "Didn't you want a Coke?" She shook her head again, too preoccupied with the man holding the tract in his hand. "I'm not thirsty." Hugh sighed, nodded a half-assed smile at the dazed-looking black man, and pulled away from the station. At the approaching stop, Hugh's face might have been as red as the octagon through the window. It wasn't just the heat. It was the moment. And the missus could tell. "Hugh?" she asked, noticing how he refused to make eye contact with her, even in the rear view like he always did. "What's the matter?" He bit his tongue and shook his head. Mrs. Birchman pressed harder. "If you really wanted a Coke, we could make a Huey." "I don't want the fucking Coke," he said. His wife swallowed and gasped. "Huey?" "Oh, don't Huey me," he said through gritted chompers. "You know damn well this ain't about no Coca-Cola." "Then tell me what it is." He swallowed as the blinker ticked on and off, the buggy immobile. "It's you. You and that damn book." "Book?" she asked as it finally dawned on her. "The Bible?" Hugh nodded fervently as if he himself were at a tent revival. "You and him," he said, glancing upward. "Behind my back. You tell him everything. We don't talk anymore. You don't sleep next to me. Sleep with me. It's been 3 months and all you do is cry yourself to sleep on the couch and go to church. I hope the pastor's giving you what you need, 'cause I sure as hell ain't." The turn signal, like an unforgiving, unrelenting metronome, just kept ticking. The engine rattled. The car shook. But the inside was silent. Mrs. Birchman gasped and held back a cry, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, cut the tears. Save them for the big man upstairs." "You wouldn't listen," Mrs. Birchman snapped. "I tried, I really did, to talk to you about James, but you wouldn't listen. You just ignored it. You miscarried. That's all there is to it. It didn't survive." "It? Huey, that was our son." "No, it wasn't even developed. It was James, Hugh, and he died. And it was a terrible thing, but you can't just ignore it. So instead, I have to kid myself that my unborn kid flew to paradise with angel wings. And it's not bad enough that you buy into that shit. But now you're handing out pamphlets to colored men in gas stations? Jesus, honey." Mrs. Birchman, heart thumping, felt the coolness of her tears soften her dried-up lips as she let out a few quiet whimpers and whispered, "I just felt led." "You always feel led." Mrs. Birchman sniffed. "Just go." Chapter 16. And they did just that. The service station and the black fella at it now distant, both on the road and on their minds. Yet, as they traveled back the way they came, toward the interstate and then 0 to 60 down Route 66, Clifford, too, was traveling, straight into the restroom labeled colored, tears gushing from his eyes, tract still in hand. One might have wrongly assumed those tears were from the putrid cocktail of poo and whatever else forsakenly floated around in that toilet bowl he now sat upon. But it wasn't so, for at that moment, that cramped little crapper was a cathedral and confessional all in one. "Lord," Clifford spewed from his face, "forgive me." He lifted the paper to his watery eyes and, tasting the saltiness, squeezed it between his fingers. "I left you, Lord, but you never left me." He shook his head woefully. "Help me to never." But he stopped. Looking up at the grime-covered ceiling, Clifford blinked away his tears and softly nodded, wiping his face. A moment later, he emerged from that room and crossed the station to his car and found himself down Route 66, pushing his wagon to a whopping 39 miles an hour, which was as fast as it could go given its age. He had to thank that woman. Chapter 17. When Terry, his boss and the proprietor of that service station of his, found out about Clifford's impromptu leave, surely he'd throw a fit with that blabbering mouth of his. And, rest assured, most assuredly, he would find out. Probably within the half hour of Clifford's departure when he took his thrice-daily smoke break. Terry, however, wasn't much worry to Clifford at that point. There were bigger fish to fry, as his dad would always say, at least in the little time that Clifford knew him. They used to spend the weekends lines down in the backyard along the creek, every now and again feeding a worm to a trout and finding themselves with a trout to feed on. Dad would go on about telling Clifford what it meant to be a fisher of men, and sometimes Clifford would snag himself a minnow in the process. Dad would then chuckle and say, "Nah, Cliff, there's bigger fish to fry," and he'd toss it back. He'd say the same thing when they all came home from church on Sunday afternoon. Ma's hands over her head, shouting about the white folks that gave them all dirty looks for sitting in the third row. Dad was always quick to dismiss it. He was just glad the three of them were together at church, and there were always bigger fish to fry. Ma said he was just trying to keep the peace, but eventually the peacekeeper wasn't around anymore, and instead, it was just Ma and Clifford on Sunday morning. Ma liked to speak her mind in those days, probably because Dad was gone, but Clifford kept to himself, waiting for those bigger fish Dad talked about. He probably wasn't referring to thanking some white woman with an extra church tract, or even the mission field for that matter. But just like those minnows swimming in that water-filled mason jar he had hidden in the closet, sometimes Clifford just couldn't throw him back. Chapter 18. The family reunion in his head was interrupted when a familiar face caught Clifford's eye along the road. It was a face a good 20 feet off the ground and wrapped in more vines and a backyard chain-link fence. It was Aaron. Only he was far paler, the sun took to that, and much bigger, with a 5-foot grin stretching across a billboard half folded over and torn into strips that draped down like circus streamers. And boy, what a circus it was. And Clifford could still remember the last time he saw that face. It wasn't even in person either. Nope. A good few years prior, Aaron had run a series of promotional advertisements for what he called at the time the Christ Encounter, which, on one hand, led a lot of misguided folks out to his boondock basilica, but on the other, led the skeptics and authorities out there too. "If you're like me," he'd lie, meanwhile faking an accent as southern and slow as molasses. "You love the Lord, but what you may not know is that He has a message for you, and you can only find it here." At that point, the camera would zoom out and there was Aaron, standing on the side of 66 with his thumb tilted sideways. A couple of interstate travelers would honk their horns, and then Aaron would twist that thumb straight up, followed by pointing his index finger at the billboard behind him, the same one Clifford just saw, before he'd point that finger at the camera and bend his thumb with a wink and a click, all the while grinning. The grin was likely meant to be endearing, but there was no masking Aaron's contempt. Still, the son of a gun had charisma, and with a gimmick like Christ Encounter, even the most rational believer would have to check the place out, if for nothing but curiosity alone. And that's when it smacked Clifford upside the head. He knew where that woman would be, and his stomach churned like weak old milk. Chapter 19. The road just beyond the exit labeled Salvation was one hardly traveled, a narrow gate, if you will. Yet, even so, Clifford could still make out fresh tire tracks over the grounded-in streaks that paved the path like a skirt stake. And while the signs along 66 suggested that there were miracles to be found at this Christ encounter, or whatever he called it now, the real miracle was finding the God-forsaken place, as if the Lord himself was mercifully shielding the outside world from whatever lay at the end of that very road, which definitely was not salvation. Instead, the path led Clifford through rows and rows of tents and sheds baking in the now setting sun. It was nearly 8:30, and even though the sun was mostly through rearing its ugly face, an even uglier one was still visible about 10 yards or so away. Though he had grown out his hair, now nearly down to his shoulders, and the end of his beard was turning an almost milky white, that squinty-eyed grin was the same. It was Aaron. Clifford stopped the car and flicked off the lights, dropping down in his seat and barely looking over the dashboard, like a fiberglass-covered horizon only missing the bobbing hula girl. Aaron shot his head back and forth a couple of times, and then, without a beat, composed himself, pulled a lighter from his robe, and flicked it beneath a cigarette, stomped it out, and strutted off towards some big building down a ways. Clifford had never been inside such a building, but by the sheer looks of it, it was an old government one. A city hall, no doubt. He watched and waited until Aaron was far enough away before turning the key, palming it, clicking open the door, and scurrying out into the impending darkness. The place that Aaron had come out of, an out-of-time petrol service station, was painted a sickly yellow color and bore the words, "The Second Coming," where the trusted name of Shell ought to have been. So that's what he was calling it these days. Clifford darted inside, bracing himself for the worst. If that couple had come here, God knows what Aaron did to him. He would have never expected Aaron to stoop to murder, but leaving a decent couple stranded in the middle of nowhere for a buck didn't seem out of the realm of possibilities for a shyster such as him. Clifford was instantly smacked with the smell of frankincense and the ringing of a hymn in his ears, which were already ringing given the circumstance. He looked around the dark room and saw only rows and rows of merchandise, including a banner for the Bible 2 above aisle 1. "Oh, Lord," Clifford murmured, only to be deafened by the same unrelenting hymn. It was, "I saw the light," and in such a dusky space it seemed almost blasphemous to his ears. However, more concerning than what was playing was just how loud it was, as if something, or someone, was being drowned out with the sound of Hank Williams. A moan. Last time he heard it, Clifford never remembered the hymn with groans and moans in the background right beside the fiddle. That's because there were no groans and moans in such a tune. It wasn't the song. Then he heard it again. It was a man's voice. One unfamiliar somehow, but he had heard it before. There was a red curtain just beyond the countertop, and Clifford dashed towards it. Beyond the veil, in a now darkened room, sat a golden throne. A faded rainbow stretched around it on the floor, and the hanging faux animals swaying in the stagnant air. For such a sight that ought to have been comforting for a church boy like Clifford, the display sent a cold chill down his spine, only accentuated by the wail coming from the door to his right. Clifford pushed it open. Inside, the room was as dark as the rest of the place. Only now he was staring through the contents of an office space. More crosses across the thing than a cemetery. And then the moan again, coming from the closet door at the back of the room. Clifford carefully crept across the shadow-filled space, held his breath, and tugged open the door. A man, soaked in his own blood by the looks of it, dropped to the cold ground. The husband of that white woman. "Help me," the man sputtered, clutching the wound in his stomach. Clifford knelt down and grabbed the back of the man's head, lifting it ever so slightly. The man coughed. "My wife," was all he managed to say before he winced in pain. You have to find her. She's still here?" The man, whom he later learned to be Hugh Birchman, nodded. He wants to..." He flinched again, trying to sit up. "Hurt her." Clifford shook his head and looked around the room. On the wall, just behind the desk, hung a U.S. flag. He stood, gently setting Hugh's head along the ground, and went up and snatched it. He rapped the stranger's stomach with the thing, and when it was taut, he stood him to his feet with one final groan. "Aaron did this to you?" "Who?" "Emmanuel did this to me." Clifford's chest sunk. It was worse than he could have imagined. Chapter 20. From a certain angle, the city hall just down the dusty path might have looked like a campaign rally for Richard Nixon, had he not lost the election 2 years prior. From the opposite perspective, the one those involved in the Maranatha decorating committee hoped that Emmanuel would see after opening the front 2 swinging doors. The place more so resembled a welcome home bash, complete with banners, streamers, and cocktail weenies grilled over an open flame by Kenny Joe Jr. It wasn't quite in the budget, which was practically zero, but with the money they saved by using those old election posters, all they needed was a bottle of ketchup and the party would be practically complete. Minus Emmanuel himself, of course. Leah Birchman was standing on a stepping stool and tying off the last of the banners reading, "Welcome back, Maranatha," on the side that didn't include the face of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., to an overhanging light that cast her shadow across the growing crowd which gathered in the small government building. Leah didn't quite know how to feel about all of this, but there was a sick feeling in her stomach that only worsened every time she thought about her husband. It had been nearly 2 hours since she last saw him, and the sun was setting on the isolated town of Armageddon, population unknown, though she supposed that she could have spun around and counted heads. There was Mickey and Fletcher, and Donna, Big Bob, 3 Marys, 2 Als, and, of course, Kenny Joe and his son. There was Ray Inkle and his cheese-and wife, Ellen, who, paired with the incurable bologna stench on her husband's breath, might have made a decent sandwich given some bread. Of course, there was Jamie, the head of the Maranatha decorating committee, composed of her, 2 of the Marys, Donna and Mr. and Mrs. Marshall, both of whom were gung-ho about the celebration ready to occur. Oh, and apparently Leah Birchman, too. "You don't see this every day in Wichita, do you, honey?" Deke Marshall said, spinning around on his heel with a mouth so hung open a fly might have thought it welcoming. His wife nodded excitedly. "Y'all from Wichita?" asked one of the owls, tiny hot dog in hand. "My parents were from Sedgwick, born and raised." Deke nodded. "We used to drive up there every morning for Sunday service. Well, until all the Catholics started coming out of the woodworks and wanting the Lord's Supper every week." He chuckled, though clearly he didn't find it funny. "A real shame. Ever since Jack Kennedy took office, the country just hasn't been the same," he said, clearly not with high hopes, or at least an affection for Frank Sinatra. "But thank God the Lord's returned, just when we needed him." Al agreed. In truth, almost all of them did. All 64 and 5 kiddos. Of the ones who had made it a point to introduce themselves to Leah, as if she were just inducted into the National Honor Society, all were self-professed believers in the faith, members of the Republican ticket, and spited because of it. "I bet you Manuel's got some choice words for this generation," Ray said, with his baloney breath as he shook Leah's hand. "They don't fear God anymore," his wife, chasing Ellen's smile with a shake of her head. "But they will now. He's back. Maranatha, sister." Leah bobbed her head. "Maranatha," she said. Ellen leaned in closer to her, uncomfortably so. "You know, it's nice to have another woman around here, especially with the kiddos and all. You and... what was his name again?" "Hugh," Leah said, immediately thinking again of her husband and his whereabouts. Their whereabouts. "Hugh, right. Do you and Hugh have any children?" Leah shook her head and attempted to back away. "No, we tried, but no." "It's all the Lord's timing," Ellen again smiled. "Maybe you can put a good word in with Emmanuel." Leah nodded along, and when she figured she'd have a chance to go find her husband, she took it. "You know, that's a great idea. Where is he?" Ellen looked around and then slapped herself on the forehead. "Well, obviously not here. Wouldn't be much of a surprise party if he were." Leah nervously giggled. "Right. He's probably in his office, busy, no doubt, especially nowadays. Oh, and if you find him, don't let him come here till 10. We'd hate to spoil the surprise, and Ray's still got to get his crossley from the tent." Leah agreed, and with a hug and a wave goodbye, scooted out of there through the door which she came in. Chapter 21. "Just the lady I was looking for," Emmanuel said. He was turning at the fork in the road toward Armageddon's municipal building and wondering where the hell everyone had gone to, because wherever they were, there too Hugh's wife would be. Running into her on the darkened street only cut out his legwork, and he opened up his arms ready to embrace her in a warm hug. A hug that Leah Birchman didn't accept, only staring him down like he had blood on his face. At first, he thought he might have left some smeared on his robe, but a quick check dispelled that matter. Have you seen my husband?" she asked, peeking around the so-called savior's shoulder. Emmanuel stood silently, arms now dropping to his sides, and silently shook his head. The sound of chirping crickets quite literally filled the silence. "Leah, may I have a word?" "I'd like to find my husband, thanks." "Beloved." He stepped closer. "Matthew 10. Anyone who loves their father or mother or son or daughter, or even a husband, more than me is not worthy of me. Do you love me?" Leah swallowed. I don't really know you, sir." Emmanuel stepped even closer, mere feet from her now. "Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord,' and I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me,'" he said, softening his tone. "But I know you, Leah." Leah took a step back, a soft breeze fluttering her near-platinum hair. "You do?" Emmanuel nodded. "I do. I know you've been a believer for many years, but you have the occasional doubts, especially when you lost your baby. You and Hugh were trying for years, and right when you thought that God had answered a prayer, He took that answer away." Leah shook her head against the chilled nightly air and sniffled a little, thinking about all those shed tears, those baby blue walls. "Sometimes the Lord answers with a no." "But I say to you," Emmanuel said, grasping her hand and feeling the warmth of it, "that isn't the answer anymore, Leah." She blinked up to his eyes, a stray tear falling down her face, with an almost fluttering feeling in her chest. What do you mean?" The long-haired stranger in the night lifted up a smile and offered it to Leah, and she returned it. "I can give you another." "Another child?" Emmanuel nodded his head, and the beautiful woman across from him almost gasped, her chest rising and falling with a heavy breath. "Of course," Emmanuel said, caressing her hand in his. "I'd love to be the one to give it to you." Her heart nearly skipped a beat, and Leah had to recoil her hand from the too-close-for-comfort savior. "Give me what?" Emmanuel's face slightly drooped. "The child." Leah narrowed her gaze. "But I know my baby's in heaven," she said through her tears, assuredly as the sun would rise the next morning. Aaron, hearing something that tickled his ears, leaned a listening one forward. "Aren't they all?" he both said and asked, though not rhetorically. Leah nodded without hesitation, and Aaron returned the gesture with a smile that, right away, Leah knew was not for sale for the sake of hypothetical babies. She let out another deep huff. "Where's Hugh?" In a blink, the soft eyes of Emmanuel turned into a dagger-like peer that could have peeled an apple. Aaron's eyes. But then, just before he broke character, Emmanuel's melodic tone came back to his mouth. "What are they doing in there?" he said, gesturing to the town hall just behind her. He placed his hand along her shoulder. Leah's voice dropped an octave lower. "I'm getting my husband and we're going home." Emmanuel, still grinning, squeezed her shoulder tightly in his hand. "Beloved," he said, his lips wrinkling to reveal a set of yellowish teeth. "You are home." Chapter 22. When the set of double doors to the city hall swung open at precisely 10:17, the entire population of Armageddon, all 64 tent-dwelling residents and 5 heaven-bound children, burst into a fit of cheers, accompanied by Ray Inkle dropping the needle on Perry Como's Joy to the World, which he had purchased last winter at the nearby Five and Dime. The tune started with a blast of triumphant trumpets, followed by lyrics more suited for Christmas, but in Ray's mind, amply fit for a Maranatha celebration. Emmanuel loosened his grip on Leah's shoulder and pretended to act surprised. He had figured some sort of welcome back shindig was under wraps for quite some time, and it was only a matter of where and when. The City Hall, or the place that used to be the City Hall of whatever this place was, made sense. But why then was a better question. Perhaps the answer was something thoughtful. The placement of the moon or the stars? Like Easter Sunday in the Farmer's Almanac? Or maybe some tie-in with the church's calendar? In actuality, however, the answer was probably a lot stupider than that. It was probably when the streamers went on sale down the road. And though tomorrow, a Sunday, would have been a more appropriate weekday for such an occasion, the Sabbath meant one thing: rigid rest, both for the residents of Armageddon and himself. And perhaps he'd even managed to get his junker out to McDonald's before the others noticed. And still, this Maranatha thing, essentially a holiday, seemed like a treasure trove. Maybe it was just the jolly tune spinning on the Crosley that begged for comparison, but it seemed like Christmas 2.0 in there. And if putting the Christ in Christmas proved anything, it's that people will pay for a jolly good time. He could see it now. Maranatha trees, Maranatha snow globes, Maranatha cookie cutter sets, and Maranatha honey glazed hams. Forget the frankincense and myrrh. This was a gold mine. By the time Emmanuel, and by association Leah Birchman, reached the center of the room, past the rows and rows of unoccupied pews as if he were in a defunct church, he spun around, still hearing the clapping of his admirers ringing in his ears, and heartily laughed. It was as if he were Santa Claus on Christmas Eve, and had the brown of his frosted beard grown 2 shades lighter, and if he ate well past his share of roasted cocktail weenies, he could have been Santa Claus standing in that same stark room. As the clapping faded, and the voice of Perry Como cut off somewhere behind the grinning crowd of disciples, Emmanuel cleared his throat and raised his hands, palms facing them like the ones that ought to have been beneath his feet. "Brothers and sisters," he said boisterously, a hush falling over the murmuring gang of his followers. "Today we are gathered to celebrate a most momentous of occasions. I have returned." Emmanuel's voice was snapped off by the roar and applause of the entire sum of his crowd. Unbeknownst to him, however, the loud clamor from inside the city hall gave Clifford outside the diversion he needed to shatter the passenger side window of Aaron's old junker. At that stage in his short-lived life, a hunk of scrap metal tucked behind the yellow gas station. "And with me," Emmanuel continued, the noise of the crowd dipping so low that Leah could hear someone behind her munching on a hot dog, "I have brought a simple question. Will I find faith on the earth?" The crowd went absolutely bananas again, like a troop of monkeys discovering a barrel of the oblong fruit. "We ought to get Billy Graham out here," one of them hollered. "Wait until my mother-in-law gets a load of this," another far more feminine voice yelled. It was a frenzy, and soon the scattered voices across the building joined in unison for a simple, haunting chant. "Messiah, Messiah, Messiah." "Brothers and sisters," he said, raising his hands again and gathering the group's attention. "For those that have eyes to see, open them to what I'm about to show you," he grinned, his eyes darting around to the few scattered children amongst the crowd, most of them mere babes. "Our sister Leah," he said, wrapping his rough hands around the back of her neck like sandpaper, "has suffered a great loss at the hands of the enemy. A miscarriage." He shook his head, and the crowd made a collective moan, some even reaching out and patting her along the arm. "But what he intended for evil, God uses for good." The crowd roared again, but another wave of his hand had calmed the sea of disciples. "Today a new covenant shall be made." He scanned the eyes of the gawping crowd and looked up to the ceiling, still draped in streamers. "The Lord has extended his hand of mercy to the innocent, his children, and offers a new path to the pearly gates of his kingdom, before the clutches of sin subdue them." His listeners all leaned in for the revelation, and Emmanuel, remembering those that tried to flee with their little ones before, couldn't help but lift a smile to his cheeks. "Just as the babes, like Leah's," he said, pulling her close, "die in their mother's womb and go home to be with the Lord, so the scriptures have been fulfilled again. To die is gain." The excited faces in the crowd twisted, some into confusion, some into shock, and others unbridled determination. Still, they all listened, and one of them, one of the faces on one of those Marys, shouted a lonesome amen as she held on to her 1-year-old daughter who was gnawing on her cross necklace and whose father was unknown, at least to most of the congregants. Between her and the baby's not-so-heavenly father, a promise was made that someday she would be considered alongside the virgin mother that shared her name. Only she wasn't a virgin anymore, and her child was not as immaculate as she was led to believe. A cosmic hiccup, perhaps, and as promised after the child's first birthday, they'd try again for another. Leah, held back by Emmanuel like a dog on a leash, cast her wild eyes around the sea of gawking strangers bobbing like boobies up and down, some scooping up nearby children into their arms as they shouted, "Praise be to God," with joyful voices. Yet not all of their faces carried the same level of zeal. Emmanuel had rightly assumed that some of the women, especially those who had carried children in their wombs, would have found the commandment difficult. Still, in their minds, perhaps this was nothing more than a test. A test like Abraham's binding of Isaac to the altar. One that, unlike basic high school arithmetic for many of them, they'd pass. Then, without warning, the doors to the city hall burst open again, and the gasping crowd, some loosening their grips around their children's necks and their arms, fell silent. Not only because 2 strangers not on the invite list, mind you, barged their way into the room, but one of them was covered in blood. The other, just a colored man, held a trembling gun in his hand, a worn Smith & Wesson. Leah's heart skipped a beat as her gaze snapped from one of the children, giggling as if at play in the arms of Big Bob, to meet her husband's face. She wanted to scream. "Aaron Kenneth Buckley!" The voice was that of the colored man, that of Clifford, and it rang out throughout the clattering crowd. A few fearful folks stepped aside, arm in arm, and Clifford stepped out before Emmanuel, Hugh limping along behind him like an injured puppy. Leah locked wet eyes with her husband, and he stood up a bit straighter, turning his head to face the man who had stabbed him in the gut. "Aaron, who?" Emmanuel said, scanning the crowd with a misleadingly mistaken expression. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. I don't know." "Everyone," Clifford interrupted, pointing the muzzle of the gun in the air. "This man's name is not Emmanuel, it's Aaron Buckley. He's a con man from Tecumseh." "And you're who?" a man's voice shouted. "A cop? A black cop?" another voice snapped back. And Clifford shook his head. "I'm a missionary from the First Baptist Church." "Which one?" someone in the crowd muttered, and Aaron grinned with Emmanuel's face. "Look, Mr. Clifford squinted at Emmanuel. "You know my name, Aaron." Emmanuel nodded. "I know everyone's name," he said, his voice quieting. "Look around. You're scaring all these poor people. Is that really what you want?" "Yep," Hugh interrupted, and he took a stumble forward. Emmanuel's eyes widened. He hadn't completely realized that Hugh was still alive. Sure, he was caked in blood, but the sight of Clifford and that gun had robbed his attention. "Brother," he said calmly, "it appears you need to go to the hospital right away." Hugh smiled up at him. "I'll do you one better, Emmanuel. How about you come over here and heal me?" he said smugly. "Come over here and heal me in front of all of your apostles." Emmanuel looked around and was met with the dithering faces of 69 men, women, and children, all of whom would have rather died than deny him. A promise straight from 69 horses' mouths. "Do not put the Lord your God to the test," he said, eyes narrowed on the two intruders. "But test the spirits," Clifford said, stepping a foot or so closer to him, Hugh following, and the circle around them shrinking, "to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." Emmanuel nodded and stepped the same distance closer to the black man, slightly older than the last time he had seen him. "You know the scriptures, but even the demons believe and shudder." He looked around, locking eyes with Hugh and his wife, and Clifford, and the rest of his congregation. "For those who have ears to hear," he nodded at the crowd, "let them hear." "Aaron, listen," Clifford said, his voice splitting down the middle and a cry oozing out. "I know what happened to your mother, what that man did to you and your family, and I'm sorry for that, but you've become that man. You're no better." "Be silent," Emmanuel snapped, for the first time a bit of Aaron breaking through. He then cleared his throat, shut his eyes as if in a brief prayer, and opened them. The mask was back on. Then the circle moved in closer around them, and Clifford and Hugh shuffled forward on quivering knees. The wall of bodies enclosing them was dense, but through the legs of those standing shoulder to shoulder with his wife on the opposite side of the room, Hugh could make out a familiar shade of red, a Coca-Cola cooler just beneath the hot dog table. "I tell you," Emmanuel said, looking from the crowd to the men, "that to everyone who has, more will be given, but from those who don't, even what he has will be taken away." Emmanuel squinted at the men, and Clifford's face grew hollow and pale, at least as pale as a black man's could get. Hugh looked around at the wide-eyed faces as the crowd watched Emmanuel point a damning finger at the two men. "But as for these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them," he spat, the words clear as crystal, "bring them here and slaughter them before me." He pointed at the ground before him. The circle moved in, and instinctively Clifford raised the gun, pointing it into Aaron's beaming face. There were wails and gasps all around, and Hugh took a step closer to his new friend, watching as his wife shook her sickly head no. Clifford cocked the revolver. Aaron, despite being directly in the line of fire, merely wagged his head. "Remember the sixth commandment, Cliff," he softly said. Clifford swallowed and held the gun out farther. It began to tremble, just as he was, and a stray tear caressed his cheek and dripped onto the floor. "I can't," he said, looking up to God with tear-filled eyes. Hugh, who overheard the divine conversation from just over his shoulder, snatched the gun out of Clifford's hand and placed his finger on the trigger. "I can," he said through gnashed teeth, and he aimed the gun at Aaron's nose. The crowd gasped again. Aaron, whose eyes were wide now, took in a short breath. "Have you no faith, Hugh?" Hugh grinned with blood-flossed teeth. "I'm keeping an open mind about it. You should too." Blam! The ricochet of the gunshot and the spatter of Aaron's blood and brains scattered over the crowd like acid rain as his now lifeless body tumbled to the floor. There were screams all around them now, and not all of them were sorrowful. Some were angry, painful shrieks from some of the flock, and just as arms began to tear at Clifford and Hugh's clothes and hair, Hugh waved the gun in the direction of the crowd, pointed it at the ceiling, and fired again. A few more screams and a banner reading, "Maranatha, come, O Lord," on the back of a red, white, and blue, and "Peace, experience, prosperity," fell onto Aaron's unmoving body, draping it like a shroud. In the brief so-called calm before the raging storm that would have been, as Aaron had put it, these folks tearing them limb from limb, Leah's not-so-golden wristwatch, a gift from her husband, beeped and beeped. She immediately raised it in the air proudly with a balled-up fist, as if it were an Olympic medal, and nearly herself began to bawl. "It's Sunday!" she yelled, scanning the crowd, and locking eyes with Jamie. "So remember the Sabbath day, and keep it holy." What a gift indeed. Chapter 23. One by one, and then two by two, the crowd began to file out of those same double doors, not a word spoken. It was as if a spell had been placed over them, and perhaps it had. Aaron, for better or for worse, had touched these people, some of them probably literally, and in doing so had convinced them not to work on the Sabbath day. And what's a bigger job to take on than ripping a couple of strangers to shreds? In that very moment, Aaron's influence was one for the better. Still, some of the flock stayed behind, approached his body, which was seeping out onto the floor, and wept. To them, it was as if Hope himself had died that night. And just as it did before at the service station, something within Clifford compelled him to approach the few stragglers and calmly whisper, "The Lord is near the broken-hearted." They looked up at him, this stranger in their midst who in their mind was no better than Pontius Pilate, and silently shook their heads. "The Lord is dead," one of them said, choking on the words. "And you two killed him." Hugh was about to snap at the disciples, but Clifford held him back. To him, these folks, as led as astray as they were like a sheep without a shepherd. "The man on the ground might be dead," he said, taking a step closer to them. "But the Lord is God, not of the dead, but of the living." They watched him with swollen eyes, and Clifford felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. He turned and Hugh embraced him. "Thank you," Hugh said in his ear, squeezing him tightly. Clifford patted the still bloody man on the back, and when he stepped back, Leah was standing just behind him. "I really should be saying that to you." Clifford smiled at Leah. She shook her head in confusion until he pulled the tiny, crumpled tract out of his pocket. She swelled with emotion. "No, no," she said, approaching and embracing him. "You saved us." When she finally let go, wrapping her arm around her husband, Clifford blinked a tear away and bowed his head. "How'd you even find us out here?" Hugh said, huffing a pain-filled breath. "Why'd you find us out here?" The black man before them, still in many ways a stranger, shrugged. "I felt led," was all he could say, and Hugh's hardened eyes turned to meet his wife's. For the first time in a long while, they softened. Chapter 24. A few miles down the same stretch of road, the worn and sun-beaten path of Route 66, Mr. and Mrs. Birchman found themselves pulled over to a roadside phone booth along their way to Grace Memorial Hospital. Leah insisted to her husband that they'd make the call when they got there, and that even a few moments were vital. But Hugh argued the same for the tiny town of Armageddon, miles back in the direction they came. One of their tires had been slashed, no doubt by Aaron himself. But that didn't stop Leah from riding the rim all the way to the ER, and thinking that perhaps she had been a bit too hard on her husband these past few months. She took his rough hand, as now he leaned against the passenger side window and kissed it. He turned to her with a grunt and smiled. "Why don't we do that more often?" she asked. Hugh was about to follow up about how he never wanted to step foot in Oklahoma ever again, but he knew full well what she meant, and squeezed her hand back. the steel wedding band wrapped around her fourth finger between his thumb and palm. He stared at the sheen of it for a silent moment, and as the bare tire rim rumbled against the pavement, thought about saving their marriage, the past 5 years of both of their lives. Leah, who was dwelling on the ring, was thinking instead about the future, wondering if they ought to have turned the buggy back around, adopt one of those poor kids from Armageddon, and finish painting those baby blue walls. Perhaps she'd wait to ask her husband until after the hospital trip. Hugh, despite never having been stabbed before, was taking the blow quite well. Perhaps it was because he found his wife safe and sound, or maybe it was because for the first time in a long one, as he entered that cramped little booth and lifted the receiver, Hugh Birchman looked up at the starless night sky and didn't mind the possibility that God might have been up there somewhere. He dialed 0 with a still trembling finger and waited before the operator's voice flooded through the tiny speaker. "Operator?" "Hello, operator. Get me over to emergency services." 25 cents. Hugh popped in the quarter that he had found in the seat next to a stray curly fry, and the dial tone hummed for but a moment. "Emergency services," the man's voice said. Hugh took in a deep breath of the phone booth's stuffy air and looked back at Leah, waiting for him in the still-running buggy. "Hello, this is Hugh Birchman. I'm calling from a phone booth just outside of... Well, I'm not sure where entirely, but the emergency is at an unmarked exit along 66. Somewhere near Oklahoma City, if I had to guess." "And what is the nature of this emergency, sir?" Hugh chuckled nervously. "My wife and I are on the way to the hospital. I was stabbed by some kind of crazed cult leader at his makeshift town out in the middle of nowhere." "Oh," the operator said. "Don't worry, he's dead. I shot him in the fucking face. There's about 50 or so people out there, too, including children. There's also a kind, colored fella by the name of Clifford that saved us. He's out there, probably preaching to whoever's listening, and keeping an eye on the place until I place this call." "Oh," the operator said again. Hugh swallowed and nodded. "There's also a dismembered officer in a Coca-Cola cooler in the office closet of the yellow-painted gas station. Officer McSomething. And, of course, there's the body of the crazed religious leader that's lying on the floor of the old City Hall building." The operator was silent before finally speaking again into the line. "Jesus Christ." "No." Hugh shook. "He wasn't."